I think my paranormal story began when I was around 5 or 6 years of age. I was a shy and quiet little girl, but nothing in my life was out of the ordinary. I had both of my parents married, and a little brother 3 years younger than me that was sleeping in the same room as me. I don't know exactly how or when it all began, but things started to get weird at night in my bedroom. Every time my mother put me to bed and turned off the lights, shadows would begin to move around and scare me. By shadows, I mean black entities, like little insects crawling on the walls, standing figures with human shapes, even faces. I was so terrified of the night that I had a hard time falling asleep, and I can't recount how many times I had to turn on my little bed light to chase away the shadows that I was seeing. Nothing bad ever happened to me during those days. These shadows were always just passing by or staring at me, even though I recalled some times that were scarier than others. I remembered one particular night when I opened my eyes and there was just a face, centimeters away from mine, staring at me with dead eyes. I was on top of a bunk bed. Every time something scary would happen to me, my instinct was to turn on a light. Everything disappeared with the light, so I made a habit to save myself like this. And now, at 26 years old, I still need to turn on the lights everywhere I go because I cannot feel at ease in the dark. Of course, I told my experiences to my parents at the time, but they did not really take me seriously. I was quite imaginative for my age, so they thought it was just my silly little brain making things up. At the same time, my vision was starting to get bad and I needed to wear glasses. They used to tell me my blurred vision was creating scary monsters with the things in my room. Every time I was seeing the things in my room, I kept repeating my parents' words to soothe me, but I was still so scared, trembling, and unable to sleep because of what I was seeing. I had bad sleeping habits because of that. I had hard times closing my eyes at night, and I always tried to fall asleep before there was no light left in the house. These experiences followed me my whole childhood, but with the years passing by, they were less frequent. The fear of the dark still lingered, but I could sleep more peacefully. When I reached my teenage years, it completely stopped. At times, I was even able to completely forget this part of my life. Funny how I never thought my house was haunted. I always knew deep down that it was my problem to bear. The rest of my family never had any paranormal experiences in this house, and none of them were particularly inclined to hear about my fear of the shadows. Even though I stopped seeing things after my 12th or 13th birthday, I still had quite the instinct for the paranormal, and I was able to feel if a place was bad or not. But I want to make it clear that I was not seeking paranormal thrills. In fact, I was avoiding those things like the plague. I was still very much traumatized, and I did not want to experience scary things like that ever again. So I cannot recall if it was during my 14th or 15th birthday years, but I had my final, most horrifying encounter. I was on vacation at my friend's grandmother's house. It was quite an old house, and there were 2 beds in this bedroom for my friend and me to go to sleep. I had slept in this room many nights before without anything happening, and nothing during the evening could explain what took place next. I woke up in the middle of the night with no explanation. I don't remember having a bad dream or hearing something. I just opened my eyes in the complete darkness. The feeling of uneasiness crept in very quickly. Something was not right. I could feel it, but I wasn't sure what yet. I finally lifted my head and saw it. Words cannot describe how horrid the thing I saw was, and how terrified I felt in that instant. Just 2 meters away from me, at the end of my bed, stood a man that I can only describe as grotesque. The man had red skin, or so I thought at first, prominent eyes, and an all-teeth smile. It was standing still and staring directly at me. We looked at each other for what felt like hours with no one moving. I was able to see every detail of it. More than 10 years later, I'm able to describe it perfectly to you. Its image is still ingrained in my brain like I was marked by a hot iron. Its red skin was actually no skin at all. It was made out of muscles, and its eyes and teeth were very apparent because it had neither eyelid nor lip. Its face was horribly deformed because there were several metal pieces under its muscles that were coming out at random places. It wore a black leather trench coat. I cannot tell you how terrified that I was. My heart plummeted to my stomach and my body felt an uncomfortable hotness within. It was the first time that I was seeing something so vivid and real, and my instincts were screaming that I was in great danger. I could not take my eyes off of the red man. Somehow I knew that I should not let it out of my sight. I didn't scream or panic, but I frantically searched for the light switch that I knew was within reach. The red man was standing still, just looking back at me. I don't know why, but I knew that it was completely amused by the situation and how scared that I was. Finally, I turned on the light, and I thought that I was saved. Remember how the light always helped me chase away the shadows? Well, this time, it did not fucking work. It was still there. It was still staring at me, and I could see it more clearly than ever. It began to shift away, getting closer to my friend's bed. Speaking of my friend, of course he woke up from the light that I had just turned on. He turned toward me, asking me what was happening. I think he knew immediately that something was very wrong from the face that I was probably making and my eyes locked on something next to his bed. He kept turning his head toward the red man that I was looking at, but he obviously was not able to see it. My friend kept asking what was wrong again and again, more panicked each time he was inquiring. I was so horrified that my lips were sealed, so I was not able to respond. The whole event took less than a minute to unfold, but here I was, completely terrified and spooking my friend to death. Finally, the red man began to fade away into thin air. During all this time, it did not break eye contact with me. It did not move its arms or its legs. It just kept staring at me with its eyes with no eyelids and staring at me with no lips. To this day, I have no explanation for it. It was neither a vivid dream nor a sleep paralysis. And I know what I saw. To further validate my experience, let me tell you another weird thing I experienced not many years ago related to this story. After forgetting about this horrible nightmare for a decade, I happened to tell the story to my father. I was still very surprised by how vividly I could recall the events of that night, and how I could describe its face precisely. I was in an almost trance-like state while taking a bath after that, still thinking about what had happened. I was recreating the red man's face in my head. I began to stare at my own face in the mirror, a mirror that was at least 2.5 meters away from me. I stared at myself for minutes without really thinking about it, just having the red man's face in mind. Somehow, a feeling of uneasiness began to stir in me. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was at first. I kept staring at my face, in my trance-like state, until I finally realized what was not right with the situation. I was able to see my face. Remember how I told you my eyesight was bad? Well, it did not improve with time. In fact, it got really bad, and without my glasses, I can't see things clearly at all. And here I am, in my bathtub, seeing things clearly for the first time since my toddler years. I got really spooked, and the moment that I realized what was happening, I saw my vision getting blurrier and blurrier. I don't know what to make of the last story. I just wanted to tell you everything that happened to me. I have my own theories, but, again, I do not seek any truth, and I still avoid paranormal things like the plague. Well, that's about it, folks. I hope my experience was interesting to some of you. It was weird and unsettling for me to put words to these events. I feel like every time I mention these things, I put myself closer to the shadows and the red man that still haunt my nightmares to this day. As I said before, I did not experience anything relevant after my teenage years, but the fear of the dark and what it hides is still here. Believe it or not, my story is true. My name is Brandy, I am 56, and I live in Washington. All these years, my kids wanted me to write down events that happened to myself and my loved ones. Quite a few members of my family have recently passed away, leaving so many untold stories that I didn't want these experiences to die with me. So for my children, here it goes. A lot of messed up and supernatural things have happened to us in our lifetime, most with witnesses. This is one of them. About 27 years ago, while house hunting for a rental, I met the former renter of this run-down but livable house. She warned me not to live in this house because I have small children. And not only was it run down, it was very haunted, and never, she was stern, never let a man live here with you because he will be taken over by the evil that resides within. Now, I'm thinking she's either crazy or she was just mad at the landlord for something. We needed a home incredibly desperately. I was also thinking that I had lived through worse, and houses could always be cleansed, so I blew it off. I ended up renting the house, but I soon realized that I should have heeded her warning. The house was musty and old, made of wood. The walls, the ceilings, and the floors were all wood. Even the bedroom doors blended in with the walls, but the bedrooms were painted on the other side. There were French doors all along the front of the house going into an enclosed but open-viewed screen porch with a front door. The main living space was long and open. The living and dining area were stretched into one long room, and it was always cold despite having the heater on and it being in the desert. It was located in the high desert of California on the corner of an acre lot of barren desert, and across the street there was a popular grocery store and a few small shops too far away for anyone to hear us. It served as a town hall back in the day, and I think a turkey ranch before that. It was 6 a.m., and we had planned a 3-day trip to the happiest place in the world, Disneyland. My kids, Michael, age 1, Penny, age 4, and Jenny, age 3, were all sleeping on my bed in our bedroom at the other end of the house so I could pack in peace for the trip in the dining room and not wake them. I could see the bedroom door, though, and it was closed. I was standing up folding clothes at the table. My boyfriend's mother, Opal, was sitting across from me when we heard the bedroom door creak open slightly. We both looked up, and it was my daughter Jenny in her little pink and white flowered onesie. I said, "Now you know it's too early, go back to bed." And she replied, "Me up now, Mommy," in her little sweet voice. It made us both chuckle, and I told Opal that I thought she was just excited. I told her no, that we weren't going right now, so please go back to bed. she stomped her foot, which we could feel vibrate through the floorboards. Opal then told me that I had better go and put her back, and I agreed. As I was making that long walk toward her, I was keeping eye contact, and as I was walking, I was telling her, "No, baby," and once again she stomps her foot, smiles, and says louder, "Me up," with the sweetest little smile, and she tilted her head. Opal even muttered, "Aw." It didn't dawn on me at the time how perfect that her little pigtails were. At this point, I'm extending my hands toward her. I get about 6 inches from touching her, and all of a sudden she turned black and disappeared, almost like sand falling to the ground, followed by the door quickly closing behind her. Opal said, "What the hell?" in surprise. Shocked, I stood there with my hands still extended, and then the fear ran through my body like hot and cold needles. My kids were all sleeping behind that door. I grabbed the handle and swung open the door, fearing the worst, only to find my little Jenny fast asleep with her sister's leg over her. Whatever we had seen, it couldn't have been her. Although unsettling, Opal and I didn't talk about what had happened, and later that morning we all piled into the car and went on our trip. We had a great time, but when we came home we were met with all of the lights on and old music playing loudly coming from inside. People were standing around in my living room. 2 separate groups, like 2 different periods of time. I turned to my boyfriend and asked how those people got in and if he left the door unlocked. He told me, "No, why the hell would I do that? You saw me lock it." We all got out of the car and cautiously approached the front door. As I got closer, I could see a couch not where our couch was, with a man in a white tank top sitting there. He was dirty, and he was looking at this boy standing in the corner with such hatred, you could tell the boy was abused by the way that he was standing there with his head down. That's when he looked up at me, and it pierces my soul even now just to think about him. The kids were scared, and the dog was growling. I grabbed the doorknob to put my key in. Just then the music stopped, and the lights went out. We opened the door, and nothing had been moved, and no one was there. I couldn't get the image of that sad-looking little boy out of my mind, and it was a while before I saw him again. It was a nice day. My boyfriend and his mother were still at a doctor's appointment, and the kids and I were out grocery shopping, having a good time. I usually kept the living room light on when I knew that we were going to get home after dark. I didn't realize we would be gone that long, and it was just starting to be dusk. I pulled into the gate, and I think the kids were a little too rambunctious, too much spare change, quarter machine candy, I guess. I sat for a moment, planning my attack with getting all these groceries, a sleeping baby, and the 2 girls up the steps and into the house, when I noticed movement in the living room. No one was home. I could hardly even see anything in there because the light wasn't on. I started to get out when the girls jumped out of the car and started running for the steps. I yelled for them to stop and ran over to them. We could hear noises like a child running around, and my eldest daughter to this day says that she saw a little boy and describes him to a T, but at that moment I thought that it might be an intruder or something like that. 3 steps went up to a landing, a locked front door opening into a windowed screened-in porch, and then the 3 French doors. I told the kids to go to the car, but they were too scared to leave my side. Both of them were clutching the back of my shirt. I armed myself with a huge stick by the landing and forged on. I burst through the front door to the porch, and he was there, his face in his 2 hands cupped against the glass, as if he was peering out, and then he vanished. It was the boy that I had seen standing in the corner before. We went inside and I searched every room with my obviously frightened children practically glued to my side. There was no one there. Was my mind playing tricks on me, and I was projecting my fear onto the girls? I turned on all the lights and ran out to get my sleeping baby and the rest of the groceries out of the car when I stopped in my tracks. There on the glass were 2 crescent moon handprints, and it was fogged up where his nose was. It stayed there for at least 20 minutes. Just to add my own thoughts here, I don't feel that we always need words to communicate with spirits or for them to get a message to us. They are not bound by flesh. It is important that you have an open mind and always keep your will strong. At night, you could look out the French doors at the stores across the street and see the vast desert behind them. The property was pitch black, so you saw the reflection of yourself and whatever was behind you. That night, everyone was asleep. It was nearly Christmas, so I was admiring the lights decorating the storefronts when I felt one of my children through the floorboards skip up next to me, and then I heard a faint giggle. I felt a tug on my shirt, so I turned my gaze to the reflection, extending my arm over as if to caress the back of his head and pull him in next to me. It didn't occur to me that this was not my child. He came in under my arm and stood there looking up at me, and all I could feel was love and sorrow. I turned to look at him, but he was gone. So I looked back at his reflection, and it was gone as well. He was about 7 or 8 years old. He had what looked like black and white Converse on, and was wearing old jeans with rolled-up cuffs. I could see the edge of a white t-shirt under a light gray sweatshirt, and his hair was sandy blonde and wisped to the side with the sweetest smile. In that moment, I felt everything that he was feeling, and I cried. I saw the images of abuse flash through my head. I don't want to elaborate on that, and he made me feel that the man was not his father, and that he loved the comfort of our presence. There were so many emotions. I went to bed and held my kids tight. I was so full of questions, like what happened to his mom? How did he die? I looked for records and was told that back in the day there were not many records kept out there in the desert. A person could live and die, and no one would know unless it was specifically reported. I felt whatever else was in the house was evil, and we found out just how evil it was the longer that we lived there. I feel I should describe the bedroom so that you can get a feel of the surroundings. On one side of the room there was my full-size bed against the wall, and a single bed next to me against the other wall, separated by a small nightstand with a lamp where my 2 little girls slept. The door to the living room was next to their bed, and at our feet was the hall door and closet. Many nights, we would see the light beneath the door get blocked out, as if someone were walking up to my room just standing there, and then they would fade away. At first we thought it was just Opal going to the bathroom, since it was right next to our room, but we found out later that it wasn't her, because she was frail and had to use a potty chair in her room. The dog would sometimes growl and scratch, but when we opened the door to the hall, no one was ever there. Almost every morning at 6 a.m., we could hear the lid to the toilet slam up and the toilet flush, but when we ran in there, the lid was down and the water was still. A phone would start ringing in my room despite us not even having one, and we would hear old music coming from the walls from time to time. At first, we thought that it was coming from the pipes of our neighbor or something like that, but we didn't have any neighbors because the lady had already moved out, and that house was completely empty. So many things happened there, but this night in particular caused me to never let my girls sleep in their own bed alone. The girls were so happy that day. They had both received a package from my mom full of princess stuff. Toys, cups, and bowls, 2 beach towels, and 2 nightgowns embossed with their favorite princess images. The nightgowns were short and silky, and after their bath they begged to wear them to bed, so I happily complied. It was quiet in the house that night. Opal was with family along with my boyfriend, and I don't remember where the dog was, but he wasn't present anyway. I tucked them in, oldest by the wall and youngest closest to me on the outside. I wasn't ready for sleep, so I put a scarf over the lamp to dim the light, so that I could still read. Now I was sitting on my bed next to them, and as I was reading, the covers slightly came down off of the girls. I didn't really think anything of it because my oldest daughter was notorious for kicking off the blankets, so I tucked them both in and continued reading. It happened again, and once again I covered them back up. At this point I was starting to feel uneasy and the hairs on my arms were beginning to raise. Never a good sign. I looked at my oldest daughter and noticed that she hadn't moved. So how was this happening? I sat back down on my bed and pretended to read while intently staring at the covers over the book pages, feeling my heart pound through my chest. Moments passed, and I felt myself trembling, trying to hold the book steady, and then it happened. I saw the covers start to move, but the girls were still. I was confused. I didn't understand what was going on. The covers were then pulled down with force. So I leapt up and grabbed the covers from the end of the bed, pulling them up. At this point I was standing next to them and my voice quivered as I yelled at whatever was in the room to stay away from my girls. I still don't know who I was yelling at. I sat on the bed next to them, gripping the covers tight when they were jerked from my hands down to the foot of the bed, exposing my girls' legs. My youngest daughter's nightgown started to rise up to the top of her thigh. She started to scream and grabbed at her leg as if she were feeling pain, waking her sister. I threw my body over both girls and screamed at whatever it was to get out and leave us alone repeatedly. I tried my best to calm the girls down and protect them. We stayed huddled together all night. This was the last time they slept alone in that house. I was able to get a bigger bed, and we all slept together from that point forward. At this point, I'm sure you're wondering, why didn't we just leave? Believe me, I wanted to, but I felt trapped. Not just by the house, but also by my boyfriend. Let me start by saying that Bill was not the nicest man. Oh yeah, from the outside he was great. He had a charming voice, and he made people laugh. Nobody thought that he was capable of doing the things that he did. They didn't know him like I did. I feel he tricked me when we first got together. I was young and impressionable. He knew I had low self-esteem, so he made me feel like I wasn't good enough for anyone else and was lucky to have him. We had children together. I knew what he was capable of, and let's just say that I didn't want to lose anyone I loved, so that's why I didn't leave him. But this was different. This was not him. This was an entirely new level of evil. I started noticing a shift in him the longer that we lived in that house. We stopped going out as a family, and he stopped working. He put bars on the windows and one-way locks on all the doors with only one key. Not even his mother cared. She would go into her bedroom and shut the door so that she didn't have to hear me scream or our children cry when he sometimes hit me. And like always, he made me feel like it was my fault. Living there changed him, though. The things he started to do were out of his character, and that made me more uncomfortable. He started watching me from dark rooms and behind cracks in the doors. When I asked him why he was doing this, he got mad and made me feel like I was crazy. When we were alone together in that house, it was even more intense. One such night, the kids were at my mother's, and we had just finished dinner. We were sitting together on the couch watching TV, and I was mending a sock. It had been a pretty good day. I noticed a change in the atmosphere, and for some reason, he seemed to have gotten quiet. I was just about to ask him if he wanted me to change the channel when a small flash of light hit my right eye. It wasn't until shortly after trying to find the source that I realized he was staring at me the whole time through a little piece of broken mirror in his right hand, hidden by the throw cover. My God, those eyes weren't his. I know him. This was not my person sitting next to me, and I was frightened to the core. He didn't even realize that I saw this, so I sprung up. His mom just had a phone installed, so I'm trying to call my mother and check on the kids. He jumped and hid the mirror in the couch cushions and started trying to reason with me as to why I should come back and sit down next to him and not make that phone call. I noticed that while he was talking, he wasn't even looking at me. He was looking behind my head, almost as if he were looking through me. I glanced at my reflection in the glass door, but nothing was behind me. I grabbed the phone and called my mother, assuring him that I was only going to be a minute. We stayed on the phone until he fell asleep, and quite a bit longer. My mother knew what was going on, but she felt helpless, as I did at that time. He got up, grumbling something as he walked into the bedroom to go to sleep on the bed, so after we hung up, I stayed awake with the blanket on the couch covering everything but my eyes while listening to him breathe until dawn, when I finally fell asleep. There was another time at around 4 p.m. We needed some groceries for dinner, so I got the girls ready and left my baby boy asleep in his playpen in the living room. Opal was napping at the dining room table, and my Bill was sitting on the edge of our bed in the bedroom. I called out to him that I was leaving, and to keep an ear out for the baby, but he didn't respond, so I repeated myself and I heard him mutter, "Yeah, sure." So we left. The store didn't have something his mother wanted, so I had to go to 2 stores. It had just gotten dark as we pulled up, and I could hear the baby crying. I rushed in, and Bill's mother was still sitting at the table. I picked up my son and he was soaking wet, and it looked like he had been crying for a while. I was changing his diaper, trying to calm him down, and the whole time Opal was getting mad at me for leaving her alone with the baby. I was furious and I told her I didn't. I left him with your son. She looked surprised. She didn't even know that he was home. What the hell? Where was he? I put my son down and told the girls to go play. Something wasn't right. I didn't think he was still in the bedroom because the lights were off, but someone was in there. It was abnormally dark. I slowly went up to the door and walked in. There was a dim light coming in through a crack in the blinds, and I saw his silhouette still sitting on the bed. He hadn't moved. His feet were on the floor, and he was slightly hunched forward with his elbows resting on his legs, cupping his hands together. The room smelled stuffy, and the air was thick. I called out his name, but he didn't reply. Once again I called out his name, adding, "You're scaring me." I moved closer, saying, "Why are you not answering me?" I saw that he was sweating and that it was glistening in the light and dripping from his head to his hands and then his hands to the floor. I could hear it as it dripped. I was shaking while I slowly made my way around him to the lamp, and I heard a growl that almost sounded like it was coming up from the floorboards. I turned the lamp on. His shirt was soaking wet. There was a pool of sweat at his feet, and his eyes were darker than I've ever seen them. His stare was fixated downward. I was afraid to get near him, but I felt like he needed my help. I started to shake him while calling out his name. He was cold to the touch. I crouched down in front of him between his legs, but honestly, all I wanted to do was run out of that room. I took his face in my shaking hands and said, "Please, Bill." Just like that, he snapped out of it. He grabbed both of my wrists and hurled me onto the bed behind him. He said in a loud voice, "What are you doing, you freak?" Then he got up and went to the bathroom. I heard him turn on the shower as I laid there curled up, not knowing what had just happened. I soon composed myself and went out to bring in the groceries and make dinner. Later he joined us as if nothing had ever happened, but I still felt uneasy. The night went on, and he was his old self, goofing off with the kids and watching cartoons. I went into the kitchen and started washing dishes with my back to the hall. I heard him in the living room with the kids. I swear, I heard him. The next thing I knew, he was behind me, and he aggressively grabbed my waist and put his mouth on me. I could feel his teeth on my neck. I jumped. He startled me. Then he looked at me like he wanted me dead and said, "You disgust me," and left the house. I don't know where he went. I didn't ask. All I know is that he was gone. He came back later that next morning, dirty, and saying something about him getting lost in the desert. I remember him telling me once that I could scream out there and no one would hear me. We eventually got out of that house after living through horror, not knowing from day to day what was going to happen next, and who was safe from that evil. Later, after his mother had moved into her daughter's house, she passed away. I felt bad because I wasn't even sad about it. I found a way to leave Bill. I made an excuse that I needed to pick up a check from the welfare department and that I had to bring the kids with me. After I got there, I told them that I was being abused, and they helped me find a safe place to go. After I didn't return that day, a detective from the sheriff's department came and asked me questions about him because apparently he stole a child and took her to that empty house. Thank God he was caught before he could do anything to her. I never let him hurt my children, but sadly, they remember him hurting me. For years after that, I would have nightmares of him appearing at the foot of my bed, clawing his way up my legs, and closing the space between our faces with his cold breath on my lips and those eyes. I would wake up gasping for air. About 9 years ago, I looked up his name and found him on a website exposing predators. I still shiver when I see small mirrors or broken glass. A few years after we moved out, I ran into the former renter, so I asked her if she knew anything about a little boy ever living there, or did someone die there, and she said, now this is not fact. She said that she heard, I don't know where though, that there was a boy and his mother disappeared, leaving him with his stepdad, who is horribly abusive. Later, the boy was found stuffed in a hole on the property, dead, and they found the stepfather's dried and decayed body on the couch in the living room. He had committed suicide. Like I said, I don't know if that's true, but it seemed pretty damn close to how I felt. I wish even now that I could have helped that sweet little boy move on. We couldn't even drive down that street for years after that, and we all cried with relief many years later when we found out that the house had been demolished to the ground and that a housing tract was being built over the land. I still wonder if those people living there are plagued by the same evil that plagued us. I'm 90% sure that the church I work at is haunted. I work in the church nursery, to be specific, which is part of the original church, which was built in the early 50s. They now have a detached main building for the adults, and my building is the youth and nursery building. The church also owns a house right next door that was built in the 60s, maybe the 70s, which the youth leader gets to live in. I've been working in the nursery alone for almost 4 years now. I also babysit the kids of the youth pastor in their house next door. At the nursery, we have mainly very old toys made in the 70s that somehow still manage to work. I've never even replaced the batteries in these toys. After Sunday school, everyone in my building except me and my kids move over to the service building, so the kids and I are completely alone. I only have 2 kids at a time since we are a very small church. Without fail, at 11 a.m. every Sunday when youth leaves the building, I will have the same 3 toys randomly start making noises. I know the kids aren't the ones making them go off, since at 11 we have snack time, so we're all at the table. At first I thought I was crazy, as it would only ever happen while I was alone with the kids. Until last year, that is. Last year we got a new pastor, and his wife decided that she was going to work in the nursery with me since the youth pastor had a newborn. We wanted extra help just in case we had a situation go down that required 2 people. Well, the toys began going off with her present as well. She didn't seem to think anything of it. Once the pandemic started, she no longer works with me, and I'm alone watching just one toddler. When it's just us, I'll hear talking, footsteps, and doors opening or closing. I don't normally feel any bad vibes coming from whatever is in the church, though, so I leave it be. Now let's talk about the house next door that the church owns. This house, I actually am slightly scared of. Things are always falling and breaking in that house. The first thing that comes to mind is 2 years ago. The kids and I were in the living room playing, and all of a sudden we heard the sound of glass breaking. We searched the house and found that all of the light bulbs in the bathroom were shattered. I freaked out to say the least, but apparently stuff like that happens all the time over there. Another time, I was changing the baby's diaper in his room. He has sliding doors on his closet. He was fussy, so I was singing to him when all of a sudden I was hit from behind. His closet door somehow fell on me. I put his door back up and into the brackets, and maybe an hour later we went back to his room to get his shoes so we could go play outside. As we were making our way past the closet door whilst leaving, the door nearly fell on the baby. Thankfully, my reflexes were quick enough that it landed against my arm instead, bruising me pretty good. I told his parents and got a very nonchalant, weird. Then comes to last night. I was bathing my 4-year-old son, along with a 1-year-old, while everyone else was next door at the church. All of a sudden, a canvas picture frame fell off the wall in the hallways closest to the bathroom. I'm pretty freaked out. I fixed the picture and got the kids out of the bath. As I was trying to get the 1-year-old ready for bed, he wouldn't stop shaking, crying, and looking into the corner of his room by his closet. He was absolutely terrified. I have never seen this baby so frightened. He's usually really very happy all the time. We immediately left the room, left the light on, and went into the living room with one of the other kids. I told his parents again, and they just said, "Yeah, it happens sometimes." I'm starting to get worried, and I'm afraid to go to work. I work either at the church or at their house at least 4 days a week, sometimes more. I'm starting to no longer feel safe. A few years back, my friends and I were at our church late at night playing D&D. Our friend Brenton was the son of the pastor. His name was Robin, and he was not only our pastor, but a licensed exorcist as well. It was 5 of us kids there. Brenton, Scott, Zach, Quashawn, me, and also Brenton's dad was in the building. My mom showed up later after D&D, making for a total of 7 people in the church. So us kids were tasked with turning the lights off all throughout the building. We ran around getting it done and decided to meet up in the chapel upstairs. That chapel is tiny, with only 4 pews on each side meant for younger kids. When the last light for the chapel where we had met up in was turned off, the atmosphere did a complete 180. Things felt different to me at least, but to my friends not so much. They laughed, joked, and focused on scaring my mom. We sat in the chapel room for a bit waiting, asking the typical, "If anyone is here, please reveal yourselves" requests. Of course, there was nothing. It made me a little upset, as my mom and I love the paranormal, and to not get anything right off the bat was disappointing. Robin, Brenton's dad, suggested that we go next door to the nursery's kid playroom. We agreed and made the 10-second trek. My mom didn't like it. She had been taking photos before with the flash on, hoping to catch something, but was refusing to do so at that point. She said she was afraid of seeing something. When we asked for a sign from anyone who might be present, the smell of vanilla perfume filled the room. You're probably thinking that it was just my mom's perfume, and I don't blame you. But no, she can't use perfume, as she gets sick when she smells it. I asked Robin what it could be, and he told me that back in the 50s, there had been an employee who worked in the nursery. She had worn vanilla perfume to work every day, and older people who had known her could confirm that. We decided to walk down to the main chapel, which was huge, by the way. We sat in the middle row of the first 2 pews. Kids sat in the second. The 2 adults in the first. All of us kids started feeling sick, like we were about to puke. Brenton's dad noticed this, and suggested that we go to the basement for one last try, and that after that we should call it a night. We all thought, why not, and decided to go. We sat in the basement on the couch facing toward the wall, which was a good distance away since the whole basement was actually a dining hall with a kitchen next to it. Next to me on the couch was my mom, Zach, Quashawn, and Robin. Brenton was actually still sick and laid out on the sofa chair in front of us, while Scott laid on the floor playing with his phone. Quashawn started snapping photos non-stop. I swear he took over 100 in the basement alone. With every photo taken, there was a red haze that seemed to grow brighter and brighter. Then we heard clicking. It sounded like a light switch coming from the storage room. We were all like, I'm not checking that out. Send Scott. He shrugged and went to go check. Sometimes I think he wants to die, but really he just doesn't care about anything remotely scary. He walked up and discovered that the storage room light was turning on and off by itself. He called back to tell us that he thought someone might be in the room. Robin stood up and told him to open the door. Scott did as he was directed, and sure enough, the light was on, but no one was in there. Scott closed the door and walked back, laid on the ground, and got back on his phone like nothing strange was going on. Quashawn was back at it again snapping photos, until one of the images made him pause entirely and say, hey Robin, can you look at this? Robin grabbed the phone, chuckled, and said, Yup, that's something all right. My mom asked to see it as well, and then emitted the loudest scream ever before running behind the couch. I asked to look at it, telling her that she had to be overreacting. She yelled at me and for the first time in my life told me to shut up. I looked at the photograph, and right in the middle of the basement, clear as day, was a person standing there. He was old and bald, with a Catholic robe on and a red sash, arms by his side. I couldn't make out anything below his knees. I saw facial features and everything else, though. I looked up, terrified, fear of what I saw rushing through my body. I screamed, jumped up, and ran toward the corner. Robin rushed and turned the lights on, making my mom feel safer. We called it quits and went upstairs. We found old photos of the priest in the church's photo albums. Robin asked me to point out the man that I had seen, and I did. It was the exact man from the basement photo, but instead a much older photo of him when he had been alive. Robin agreed that he did indeed look the same, and so did Quashawn, along with my mom. We packed up the D&D game, put everything into the car, and we all drove home. Sadly, we tried to recover the photos and transfer them to a computer, but all of the files showed up as being corrupted. After this experience, nothing else has happened, at least aside from one instance. Our friend's dad was leaving the church, so we did one last game night with no ghost hunt, where we played D&D for 6 hours straight. This was only a year ago. We were packing up the car. Everyone was outside talking. I walked to the front of the church, just reminiscing about all the good times that we had there, and how it felt like a chapter of our childhood was coming to an end. That's when I saw a black figure in the bell tower. I stared at it and knew that it was staring back at me. I looked at it one last time and walked back to the car without telling anyone. We missed that church every day. I stopped going after Robin left. One day I was sent to clean up the nursery with no help. The whole time I was in there alone, I felt as though I were being watched and didn't feel safe. I ran out for the last time when I heard a little kid giggling in the playroom. This isn't my story, rather that of my parents and 2 incredibly close family friends. Before I was born, the 4 of them used to hang out a lot. They would often drive out far into the Mojave Desert to party and drink around a fire, just have a good time in general. So they drove way out into the desert to have their friendly ritual. It was summertime and incredibly hot. Even late into the night, it still wouldn't have been cold. My mom, Stacy, and her friend Gina started getting scared about tarantulas at one point. They decided that they didn't want to camp out there after all. That's when all 4 of them began driving back. It was around 2 a.m. They were on a dirt road that went on for miles with no sign of civilization anywhere along the way. Suddenly, up ahead in the headlights, they saw what appeared to be a man in a long black trench coat, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The collar of his coat was pulled up. He was walking along the side of the road in the same direction that they were driving. My dad had grown up hitchhiking a lot, and used to pick up hitchhikers as well, so my mom knew that he would probably consider stopping and talking to this guy to see if he needed a ride. But then, they all got a terrible feeling about him. My mom always told me that the way he was walking, the way he looked and dressed, and how he was in the middle of nowhere. Him and the whole scenario were emitting this really messed up energy that came off as horrifying and evil. Gina felt the same way. My dad starts joking, "Hey, let's pick this guy up." And my mom and Gina immediately started screaming and crying, begging him not to. They were in the back seat. My dad was driving, and their other friend Brad was in the front passenger seat. Gina even started punching my dad in the back, yelling at him not to stop. I guess my dad slowed way down as they passed, and they all turned to look at him as they went by. However, the moment the nose of the car actually passed him, he was gone. It was as if he disappeared into thin air. It wasn't as if there were rocks or trees for him to hide behind either. The weirdest thing of all is that I grew up hearing this story from my parents, but living very far away from their friends. When I was very young, we moved up north and they lost touch, even though whenever we would come back to California to visit, we would always get together with them, and it would be as if nothing had changed. I moved back here to California as an adult, and I work for Gina now. One of our first conversations when I came back was about the Hat Man. She brought it up, not me. And she told me word for word the exact same story that my parents had always told me. To be honest, I've always secretly feared yet been simultaneously intrigued by this entity because of hearing this story. Of course, now I've seen so many others online to compare it to that I am more fascinated than ever. This story took place when I was a kid. My dad has been a pool man for many years. One of his oldest customers decided to purchase a ranch. I don't exactly remember where. He asked my dad if he could come and fix their pool, which was disastrously maintained before he bought it. He gave my dad permission to bring us along, and told us that we were welcome to stay a few days to enjoy the ranch. We drove there, and I had been in charge of reading the MapQuest instructions because I never seemed to be able to sleep during car trips. We drove back home a few days later, after my dad was finally able to save the pool. The drive home was very long. For endless stretches, the view was mostly desert, farms, and the occasional small suburban town. Unlike me, my mom and brothers were knocked out almost immediately. So most of the trip, it was just my dad and I talking or listening to music. I'm also a very avid reader, so I had a book on my lap beside the maps. I remember the ride had been quiet for a while, because I had been reading. I had to stop because it was getting dark, and my dad would only let me turn on the dome lights to read the maps. No radio service, and the Game Boy batteries had all died. All I had left to do was stare out the window. All of a sudden, I spotted a very tall shadow on a roof. I realized that there was a man who seemed to be wearing a hat, bowler or top hat, dancing and jumping from rooftop to rooftop of this suburban lot. It was kind of like the scene from Singing in the Rain, which, at that point, I had not yet seen myself. It took a second for me to realize that this was not a normal thing to observe. The houses were separated in a way where a normal person couldn't possibly have jumped from roof to roof the way that thing was. What scared me the most is how at the last house before a field, he seemed to turn around and sense me. He bowed and tipped his hat. Even though I couldn't see it, I could also sense that he was smiling. All I felt was dread. I turned to my dad to see if he had also seen it, but he had of course been paying attention to the road. When I looked back, I couldn't see the houses anymore. They were way behind us. I never saw a face or any details. He was just a silhouette on the roofs. I remember the feeling of being afraid that it would follow us. That it could, if it wanted to. I never saw something like that on our many road trips ever again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it, but it felt so real. The memory is so vivid as well, which always comes back when I'm watching old musicals because the dancing reminds me of the way that he moved. This happened today at a church that I took my grandma to. I haven't been since I was a kid, and figured it might be nice to go again. At first, the church seemed very homey. I come from a small town in Kentucky but live in a city now, so I really enjoyed the change of pace. A lot of people at the church also used to live in Kentucky and still have family there, which made it feel as if there were a small piece of home right there with me. The service was short and simple. They started out with praise and worship, followed by prayer. After the prayer, they opened the side door and invited God, the Holy Spirit, and His angels into the church. Then they had an evangelist come in and preach a sermon. I was getting weird vibes at this point for whatever reason. I figured it was because I hadn't been to church in so long, and it had to do with a few personal reasons from my last church experiences. I was sort of zoning out while the evangelist had the stage. He got really into his sermon. He was yelling and putting his arm out toward us. Mid-screaming/preaching, his microphone messed up, and it made him sound demonic and loud. I know technical issues like that can happen, so I didn't think anything of it. He changes his microphone and carries on. While he's going on again, there's knocking at the side door, and all of a sudden it just flies open. I initially chalked it up to the wind, but the lights began to flicker as he continued talking. Everyone kept praising God and saying that the Spirit was in the church. They really seemed to enjoy these things that were happening. After the service was over, the preacher's wife went up to the podium and said that while all the weird stuff was happening, that she could hear everything upstairs. She also said that while she was up there, that she saw things running past out of the corner of her eye, and that a door had been slammed in her face. Not quite sure what to think of all this. I've never experienced anything in a public place like that, and definitely never expected to in a church. Like I said, everyone was really into it, and said that it was God, or angels. I'm an open and spiritual person, and have experienced a lot of paranormal, but I didn't feel that whatever that was a good thing. I felt bad vibes before things started happening. Vibes that I continued to feel up until we left there. I'm a 14-year-old girl, but when I moved into this house, I had just turned 12. The house was fine, and was very quiet since before this I had lived with a ton of family, but now there were only 4 of us. We moved in the day after Thanksgiving, and it felt great to have my own room that I didn't have to share with any cousins or siblings, so I spent a lot of time up there basking in my newfound alone space. Let me emphasize this. When we moved in, I felt nothing. No presence, no spirits, nothing paranormal, nothing off. That is, until December rolled around. The first week of December is when I felt it for the first time, like I was being watched by something. Like when someone stares at you in public, and you have that instinct to look at them, that's how it felt. I always felt watched in my room, to the point that I hated being alone up there and spent all my time in the living room or in my parents' or brother's room. The first week goes by and I try to ignore the feeling. I chalked it up to me being paranoid because it was a new house, but still, the thoughts stayed in the back of my mind. Finally, I told someone who may have answers for me, my aunt. She's my mom's sister and she has always believed in the paranormal for as long as I can remember. She got me into it for a while before I stopped believing. I believe again now, because this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. She explained that it was probably a nice spirit watching over the house and, hopefully, me. I hoped that was the case, and in a way, it was. Over time, I would feel it any time I entered my room, and especially when I was trying to fall asleep. It creeped me out so much, and I just wished that it would go away. Then it went from watching me to making contact. One night I was home alone because my brother and parents were visiting Santa, and I didn't want to go that year because I felt sick. I was in the kitchen making hot chocolate when I felt breathing on the back of my neck. It was hot and made my hair stand up. I froze in fear and stood there until the microwave went off. When it began to beep, the breathing faded away as if whatever were there had just walked off. I made the hot chocolate and sat on the couch. I was so freaked out that I was just there staring at the TV in shock until my family got home. Worst part is that I could still feel something staring at me, and this time, it wasn't in my room. Finally, the week of Christmas came, and the excitement made me forget about the incident prior until it happened again. Me and my mom were hanging out in the kitchen when she turned around to answer a question that my brother had asked her. I felt the hot breathing on my neck, and this time it stayed there longer. I froze again, unsure of what to do. I panicked and got up and went over by my mom, who was very confused. After that, I felt the breathing constantly, even on Christmas while opening gifts. It lingered. I finally got fed up one day while sitting in my room. It became less scary and more annoying. I said something along the lines of, "Stop breathing on me," and it stopped completely, and I was shocked. I didn't think it would actually work. After that, I began to have the same dream, but slightly different, every single night. It would begin with me at some park that I've never seen in my life, and me and this boy sat on a bench together. We would begin to talk, and it was actually quite peaceful. We would just converse and stare around at the people walking by. He had brown hair and brown eyes, and was really tall compared to me. I'm about 5'4", and he was like 6 feet. The dream would end, and I would never remember anything we talked about, just that it was a good dream. Flash forward to right after Christmas break, a friend, let's call her Danielle, came over to spend the night. We both heavily believed in the paranormal, and she decided because of this whole watching and breathing thing that she would bring her Ouija board. I had always heard different things about them, but decided it was worth a try. We began talking to the thing that watched me, and the reason I knew this is because it always had this very specific energy. I knew it because, like I've said this whole time, he was up my butt. We first asked what his name was, and he replied, Nolan. I was pretty shocked that the board actually worked, and I was pretty mesmerized. I then asked if he was the boy that I talked to in my dreams, and again, he said yes. I was pretty happy that he was nice, because before, I was quite terrified that he was a demon that wanted to eat my bones, but was relieved when it was just a 15-year-old boy. He then said he doesn't like summer and prefers winter, which explains the only appearance being during winter months. Cut to next December, the watching and breathing had stopped during March through November until it began again, only this time stronger. He began screwing with me. He would open cupboards that I had just closed, or move things that I put in specific areas, only to find them in strange places far from their original area. I always knew that this was Nolan, who I had begun to call Noel. Time went on and the dreams became more vivid, and I remembered the conversations that we had, and it was still nice. Nolan became a good friend, even though I couldn't see him. That December came and went, and now we cut to this year. This is where I wish that Nolan never existed. So because of financial issues and other problems, my dad's family had to move in, my grandparents, aunt, and cousin. And me and that cousin were never super close. I'll call him Connor. Connor was super annoying. He always made messes that he never cleaned up. He never did chores, never did or went to school, and would do stupid stuff for attention, yet he always got what he wanted. By now, I'm 14 and Connor is 12. December rolls around and I'm excited to talk to Nolan. Me and Danielle are still friends and do weekend Ouija sessions with him. So we're home alone, me, Connor, and Danielle, and we decide to introduce Connor to Nolan. So we set up the candles and everything and begin. Things are going smoothly, until Connor starts calling Nolan names. He was saying some pretty mean stuff too. Me and Danielle were trying to get him to stop, but nothing was working until Nolan got really, really mad. Doors began slamming open and shut. Cupboards were going nuts. Our TV was flickering channels and the windows sounded like someone was beating on them. Finally, I looked into the doorway to the hall, where everyone's rooms were besides mine, and there was a tall figure standing there, not moving, as everything went haywire. I screamed and said goodbye, standing up. Danielle was yelling for Nolan to stop, and Connor had begun to cry. Finally, I screamed for him to stop, that he was scaring me, and the figure disappeared, and the cupboards shut along with the doors. The banging stopped, and I just sat on the floor sobbing. Danielle wasn't crying, but I was terrified and just stood there silently. Connor didn't say anything either, but continued staring at the floor with tears in his eyes. Finally, our parents got home, and me and Danielle went to my room while Connor went back to the basement where he stayed with my aunt and grandpa. Danielle had fallen asleep, but I couldn't, so I began talking out loud as I felt Nolan was in the room. I started saying how it wasn't okay that he had really scared me, and I felt the breathing on my neck. Finally, I fell asleep, and things were fine. I dreamt about him again, and all was normal. About a week after that, Connor wanted to talk to Nolan again. Apparently, Nolan was giving him nightmares. Ones where he was chasing him throughout our house, trying to kill him. Nolan would scream about how Connor needed to leave me alone and stop bothering me, or he would kill him. Connor was obviously terrified, and wanted to say sorry, I guess. I'm not sure, but me and him sat down with Danielle's board, which she had left the week prior, and we began to talk with him. Nolan kept spelling out things like murder, angry, and my name over and over again. Our candles went out and knocking began on the window behind me. It went very slow at first, just a simple knock, knock, knock. Me and Connor froze. I couldn't move and I didn't want to turn around. Finally, I told Nolan that I was scared and that he needed to leave Connor alone and stop. The knocking stopped, and the board spelled out, sorry, then, Connor bad. After that, Connor decided to call it quits and go to bed. I decided to go into my room and try to talk to Nolan again. I started by being nice and asking him to knock once for yes, two for no, something that we usually did. But he got angry fast. He started to bang on my walls at the mention of Connor. My lights went out, and so did my TV. The banging was loud, and if I'm honest, it was terrifying. He was throwing my pillows and banging on my windows, like the night that Danielle was here. I was crying so hard that I could barely breathe and was hyperventilating and sobbing so hard that I could barely talk. Nolan stopped after I let out a strangled cry for him to leave me alone. After that, he stayed away, for a day at least. The next day I woke up, and the Ouija board sat in the middle of my room. I kicked it hard and walked downstairs. I was eating at the kitchen table talking to Connor about the night before. He said he had another dream about Nolan, except it wasn't a nightmare. It was exactly like mine in the park. They talked. I'm still confused about why Nolan would do this. I felt breathing on my neck while eating and basically told Nolan to screw off. I was still mad at him from last night. He did pretty quickly. I didn't feel him for a while, until last night, when Danielle came over for a sleepover and I decided to talk to Nolan. He obviously wanted to talk, so he sat up in my room, and he came through faster than I've ever seen. Now what happened next is what I really need some answers for. We began talking and he spelt out sorry, but then he did something I've never seen him do. He spelt out love, and I honestly don't know what that means. He would emphasize it and barely answer any questions after that. Danielle then made the mistake of bringing up Connor. Nolan got pretty mad and started to bang on the walls again. I yelled at him to stop and he did. I didn't say anything after that. Today I called my aunt for advice. She said he may just be an overprotective spirit, but I'm not sure if that's the case here. I don't know if Nolan is bad or not. He isn't to me, but he is to Connor and sometimes even Danielle, but never to me. All I know is that I won't be talking to Nolan for a while, a really long while. And even now, while typing this out, I can feel his breath on the back of my neck. I've had several unexplained encounters which I guess you could say are paranormal. I've never believed in that kind of stuff until the experience that I'm going to tell you now. There's a creek below my house where me and my friend would go to hang out when we were kids. It was away from everyone, where we could do whatever we wanted to. We'd normally build a fire and just chill and bring a radio so that we could listen to music. One day I decided that we should go fishing since we never have down there and there's a bunch of deep spots that are perfect for it. So I get my grandpa's old fishing rod. It was literally a piece of bamboo with a fishing line tied to it. I don't know why, but I just wanted to test it out. He brought his dad's old fishing pole. Both my grandpa and his dad had unfortunately passed away years ago. We pack everything up and head down. We decide first to start fishing near the entrance to the creek because there's a few deep spots there. So we bait our hooks and I throw my line in and he does second. As we're waiting for a bite, my friend tells me someone is coming. I turn around and see no one, yet he says he can hear walking. I keep looking and soon I see a man coming around the corner wearing a hat and overalls. He's very dirty as well, like he just got done working on a car or something. When he sees us, he stops and stares. My friend starts freaking out and telling me to get my knife, since I always carry one. I, however, feel like he wasn't a threat, and just watched him. My friend has always been nervous around strangers and has a fear of them. He begins walking toward us without a word, and stops only a few feet away from my friend. He doesn't seem to acknowledge me and doesn't even look at me and my friend. He stares at him without uttering a word. My friend finally speaks up and says, "Can I help you?" The man simply replies, "Have you seen my wife and kids?" He also calls my friend by name. My friend replies, "No, I haven't seen anyone else down here." The man says nothing and walks away, and as he walks around the corner, I follow him, and as I look around the corner, he vanishes. I see no trace of him, and there's no place he could have gone except straight, because there's fences on both sides. I look back at my friend and tell him he's gone. My friend tells me that's not possible unless he could run extremely fast uphill. I then asked if he knew him because he called him by name, but he swears he has no idea who the man was and has never seen him before. We both decided that was enough for one day, packed everything up, and left. We never saw him again, though we've been down there hundreds of times since that incident. Not long ago, however, I stumbled upon a gravestone hidden in thick grass at the same creek. It was a man who died in the 1970s, who was also a Vietnam veteran. I wanted to start this off with a trigger warning, as it does speak of suicide. There isn't any detail of how this person died, but I know that this subject is hard to read about and listen to for others. Back in 2018, I met a really sweet girl at my church, and we became pretty good friends. We would sit by each other or nearby every service. We attended canned food drives to help others around Thanksgiving. We sat together with a few older couples at church lunches, but we weren't close outside of that. At one point, we had each other's Snapchats before I deleted mine. The week before my birthday, I went to church as normal, ate breakfast with another friend of mine and her kids, and made my way to the sanctuary. I saw Lily sitting on the right-hand side of the aisle, and I sat next to her. We talked for a bit before the service started. However, halfway through, she got a phone call and left. She didn't come back, so I figured that she had had a family emergency or had to go to work early. I finished up at church, talked to my pastor and his family, and then headed home to give a couple piano lessons. Nothing else odd or weird crossed my mind. I just carried on with my week until next Sunday. The following Sunday happened to be my birthday. I was excited because it was my golden birthday, the year of 25. I don't usually like to celebrate, but this was gonna be a good one. I'm a newlywed spending the day with my husband and having my favorite coconut cream pie instead of cake. I still wanted to go to church that morning, though. I love my church and church family and spending time with them. From the minute the church doors opened, everything was off. I went down to the basement and had a cup of cold coffee, a bagel, and I noticed a few people around me who were just pale, cold. I can't even properly describe the sadness on their faces. I'm a pretty introverted person, so I didn't ask any questions. I just went back upstairs to the sanctuary and waited for the service to start. My pastor walked up to the podium with tears in his eyes. He began telling us about how there was a tragedy within the church. Lily had committed suicide the weekend prior. Friday night, to be specific. I started crying uncontrollably. I didn't know that she had been dealing with thoughts of suicide, and I felt like an awful friend. We had a beautiful service dedicated to her before her funeral. We all sang songs that she loved, prayed for her mother and family, and prayed for her. I left right after church. I went straight home. I didn't think about the details of her death, because it just hurt too much. A few hours later, though, I remembered the previous Sunday. I had seen her at church. How was that possible, though? She passed away Friday night, but I somehow saw her on Sunday. I sat right next to her. We talked before service started. I watched her answer her phone and walk out. I became angry, scared, disappointed, depressed, every emotion that comes with losing a friend at such a young age. I fell into a hole. After I had grieved and prayed for a couple days, something came to me. My church does live streams, and there would have been a clear view of our service and us sitting next to each other. I logged onto my Facebook, found my church's page, and started searching for the date that I had last seen her. The strangest part of everything is, every live stream is in chronological order, so I figured that it would be pretty easy to find. But to this day, I still haven't found it. I asked the person in charge of recording and uploading the sermons on Facebook where it was, and he said that somehow that there had been technical difficulties that day, and that they were unable to stream the service or even catch any audio. This has racked my brain for months. To this day, I feel as if she had been there on church that Sunday to say goodbye to me. I asked other members if they had seen her the week before, and they all said that they couldn't remember if they had, or they corrected me by saying, "Honey, she passed away last Friday night. There's no way she could have been there." My church is fairly small, and we only have a morning Sunday service, so there's no possible way that I could have gotten my days mixed up. I've had many ghostly encounters in my life. Way too many for me to even count. I'm going to continue to write about all of them, because writing about it honestly is the only thing that brings me peace and sanity. This one hits the hardest, though. I wish I had more answers than I do, or some sort of proof, but I don't. I didn't have any eerie feelings when I last spoke with her. She didn't feel like a ghost or an apparition. I feel like she was truly there, without a doubt. I hope that one day I can find some answers, or an explanation at least. But for now, I have to keep telling myself that this is how Lily decided to say goodbye to me, and learn to be okay with it. I have a few stories that I can't explain, but this is the one that I feel I need to share because it happens to align with a type of experience that so many people have reported throughout the years, arguably since ancient times. I'd always been certain of what I saw, but when I first became aware of shadow people as a commonly reported phenomena, any doubt that I had about the incident disappeared. So many people have tried to tell me that what I experienced was just a dream or simply brushed it off with that look that says this guy is either nuts or lying. And honestly, it's time that people start taking victims of paranormal visitation at their word. In an age where we're starting to wake up to the fact that victims of all forms of abuse deserve a voice and representation, it's sad to see that so many people are disregarded as mentally ill or confused just because their experience lacks an accredited scientific explanation. My experience was not as extreme as some that I've heard from others on various paranormal forums and podcasts, but it has affected my life in a number of ways, and to have the source of so many anxieties and frustration in your life disregarded as a dream or a fiction leaves a person feeling very alone, unable to really explore their trauma, because the subject is so taboo and very few people are willing to take your account seriously and help you search for answers. This is my story. And I assure you, I have nothing to gain by bringing you a false account. I just want to put my testimony out there so that other experiencers can know that they are not alone and that they are, probably at least, not crazy. There are things in this life that do not yet have a scientific explanation, and humanity is not the only sentient intelligence that operates in this world. Beyond that, I really don't know a damn thing. But accepting the fact is the first step in beginning to fully understand the nature of this world, or any others that may exist. The first time I saw it, I was about 8, maybe as old as 10. I was living in a dingy little house in Clear Lake, Iowa, in what you would consider to be the trashier part of a small tourist town. My room was at the end of a long hallway on the right side of the hall if you were looking toward it from the kitchen on the opposite end. Across the hall, the left side, was my toddler sister's room, and in the middle of the hall on the left was the door to my parents' room. One morning I got out of bed and started to move toward the kitchen. When I was just about at my parents' door, looking toward the kitchen, the figure appeared. It sort of leaned into the hall from the living room, which was adjacent to the kitchen. It was a tall, black figure. Black as in pitch black, but sort of smoky and hazy, like it was just a bunch of compressed black smoke molded into a human form. Everyone seemed tall to me as a kid, but this thing certainly seemed taller than my parents, who were about 5'5" and 5'6" respectively. The only distinguishable feature on the being were that it had 2 glowing red eyes, just like circular LEDs, on its face. They didn't really seem to be the size and shape that a human eye really is, but truly round and glowing very brightly. This detail I'm sort of fuzzy on, but that's what I recall. From the moment it leaned into view, the thing was just watching me, and when I saw it, I stopped and watched it back. I wasn't exactly scared, but had the distinct impression that this was all it was there to do, to watch. I knew that this wasn't something that I should be seeing in the real world, and I was uncomfortable, but all in all, the thing was non-threatening and didn't make any advancements on me. It just stood there for a minute or two, and then leaned back out into the living room. I didn't follow it to see if it had disappeared. I just went back to my room until my parents woke up. I never, quote-unquote, woke up from this experience. My day progressed seamlessly into a normal day. I knew that this was not a dream because I was very familiar with my dreams. I had constant night terrors in this house, but I'll get into that later on. The point being, the kinds of dreams that I had were more distinctly bizarre and surreal than this experience, and I always woke up with an understanding that what I had experienced that night was just a dream. This was not the case that morning. If I was dreaming that morning, then I'm still dreaming, because like I said, I never woke up from it. The second experience was just as brief, but a bit more menacing. I can't say how much time passed between the two events, but this incident was dead in the middle of the day, full daylight with other people in the house going about their daily business. My mother was in the living room, and I had just walked into the kitchen and toward the hall. I was now standing approximately where the figure had been on the first occasion, looking down toward my room and my sister's. Suddenly, the figure appeared. This is where it gets really bizarre, because the thing actually crept out of my room. I mean, this effing thing was literally creeping, like some old school Scooby-Doo villain walking on tiptoes with its arms raised and hands bent toward the floor. If you get what I'm illustrating here, you should probably laugh because it was just as goofy as it sounds. It crept from my room into my sister's room, which is what really freaked me out by this event. The whole thing was over in just a few seconds. Moving in this bizarre manner, it had its head turned toward me the entire time. From the moment that it crossed the threshold of my door, its eyes were already on me as if to say, yeah, I'm here, straight creeping around your house, and there's nothing you can do about it. No one's gonna believe you. I had already told my mom about the first sighting, and of course she had dismissed it as a dream or my overactive imagination. So I didn't bring it up, but I was really scared that it had some sinister intentions with my sister. I do remember her having some nightmares around this time, which I heard from my room, her crying to my mom about how the quote-unquote creature from the Black Lagoon was standing in the corner of her room. I asked her about this years later, but she doesn't remember any details on that. So that's it. That's all I saw of this shadow person. But there's another element to my life at this house that I feel might be relevant to what I experienced. As I mentioned earlier, I was prone to night terrors while living in this house. Vivid but bizarre nightmares that almost always had something to do with being chased by various demons, monsters, etc. One recurring type of dream I had went like this. I'd be laying in my bed, everything seeming to be completely normal in my room, as it was in waking life, but I would get this feeling. It was this instinctual understanding that something horrible was about to come through my door. I would start to panic, but would be unable to move my body, so rather than use my arms and legs to physically leave my bed, I would, through a sheer force of will, hover off of my bed and float to the corner of the ceiling, as out of reach as possible. Nothing else was really different about my room and these experiences except for that dread. The dread that something was trying to get in. Another night I had a similar dream, where I woke up in my familiar room to find a tall, hairy man standing above me, reaching for me. I had the strong sense that this skinny, ape-like man was there to take me, and I recall doing my best to resist him, but the ending to that dream is fuzzy. That scares me to this day, more than the shadow person encounters, because the hairy men are a pretty common occurrence in high strangeness research, so I can't help but worry that there was some reality to that experience. I bring these dreams up because it seems that vivid nightmares in certain locations, this happened only in that house, that also have reported paranormal activity, indicates a relationship between the two. If you subscribe to the idea that these beings feed off of fear, then it seems plausible that the two are connected. My dad was a pastor at a church for 4 years. Many people had died in this church before we got there. Over the course of these 4 years, some of the craziest, inexplicable stuff happened. I'm here to tell you a few of the best stories. My parents went to Maine every year. I had gotten tired of the trip and decided to stay home. I went over to the church to grab some snacks from the back of the old sanctuary. There were 2 sanctuaries. One was about 90 years old, and the newer one was about 50 years old. Anyways, I went to the back where the snack booth was. Mind you, this was the middle of the day, so it was completely lit up through the stained glass windows. I bent down to grab some drinks from the mini fridge under the counter. When I stood back up and turned to walk out, I saw this figure standing in the doorway. It had no nose, mouth, eyes, or ears. It was just a bald head wearing a long, dark robe. The moment I laid eyes on it, it vanished. It's safe to say I ran out of there as fast as humanly possible. Another time, my cousin came over to spend the night at my house. We wanted to play PS4, but the other controller was over at the church. So we walked over there through my yard. It was pitch black out. When we opened the door, we might have made it 2 or 3 feet in before we heard the loudest, spine-tingling scream that I have ever heard coming from the back of the new sanctuary. We ran back outside and back into my house so fast. My cousin was on the verge of crying and kept saying that he was never going back into that church again. The church had a preschool in it. They would change out the toys in the classes every now and then so that the kids wouldn't get bored of them. One time the teacher took one of the kids upstairs to help her pick out some toys for the rest of the class. The old classrooms upstairs were used for storing said toys, extra chairs, and old desks at the time, so there was no one else up there except for the 2 of them. As the teacher was grabbing the toys, the kid that she had brought to help said, "Hey, look at those kids playing with the toys over there." These are just a few of the experiences that people have had. I could sit and write out hundreds of paranormal experiences linked to that church, however, if I had the time. I have had 2 premonitions up to now. Both happened in 1992, a long time ago, but a year full of disasters in the Netherlands. In both dreams, I was standing in front of a window, observing the disaster unfolding. These dreams were also so vivid that I can still remember them in clear detail. The first one was that suddenly, I was in an office looking outside overlooking a chemical factory. I immediately knew that it was the Sindhu factory nearby. Suddenly, one of the reactor vessels exploded, setting the whole of the factory into flames. A few days later, on July 8, 1992, it did indeed happen. A trainee operator used the wrong recipe for the process. The reactor vessel overheated. The company brigade started cooling the vessel down, but to no avail. The vessel exploded. One of the valves was found 2 kilometers away. The 3 firemen died, and 11 other employees were injured, of which 1 had very severe burns. A few months later, at the end of September in 1992, suddenly I again had a vivid dream of standing in front of a window, this time at the Zilmer area in the southeast of Amsterdam. I saw military planes dropping bombs on a block of apartments. In the early evening of October 4th, 1992, an El Al cargo Boeing took off from Amsterdam Airport, heading to Tel Aviv. Just after takeoff, the captain notified traffic control that they had lost power in 2 engines and requested to return. What he didn't know was that he not only lost power in these engines, he physically lost the 2 engines. I think that they were actually the bombs that I thought I saw falling. The captain had very big troubles in controlling the airplane. He made some circles go up to the point that he could not hold the plane anymore, and it plunged almost nose down into the corner where 2 blocks of apartments met. It left a burning hole of rubble, 8 stories over a length of about 10 apartments, gone. The death toll was 43, of which 4 were aboard the plane. I have since then not had these kinds of dreams anymore. Maybe because both disasters happened within a radius of less than 10 kilometers from where I lived back then. I've always felt that someone was watching me, always with me, just watching, but nobody was to be seen. It was one night during a November break after my birthday, around 2:30, when I started to feel sick, so I got up to use the bathroom. My room was in the basement right next to my parents'. I left my room, and we have this hallway. I walked down, and it was pitch black. I was going up to the door that leads to the stairs, and for a quick second, there was just a girl standing there, and then she just floated up and disappeared. I was so scared, but I really had to use the bathroom, and we only have one that was upstairs, so I continued my journey and used the bathroom. It took me about 20 minutes to get my head together, and then I went back downstairs to bed. Since I moved into this house, 3 a.m. has always been scary to me because I hear a lot of things, and my parents just think that I'm crazy. But the clock hit 3 a.m. I was already scared for my life, and I said, I'm just going to try to go to bed. I tried for about 10 minutes, and it felt like I was being watched still, so I said, Hello, is anybody there? No one answered, but a moment later my painting fell off the wall and hit the shelf that was holding my mirror, to fall and shatter. I've always had a spooky feeling about that mirror, and I was crying in fear. After I calmed down, around 3:50, I was going to bed again, and I felt a tug on my foot, but just pushed it away. After the 3rd time, I sat up and saw the same girl from earlier. Her bright green eyes glowed, but her long, blue, scruffy dress was beautiful. It was scary, but I felt like I've seen her somewhere, or she looked really familiar to me and looked like a younger version of me. Ever since then, I haven't heard a word or peep out of anything, but I still feel her presence. I have a story of the first time that I saw a ghost in full body manifestation. It was to the point where they looked human. I've had other encounters and experiences before, and all were shadowy horrors, but not this ghost. It almost felt like a guardian angel, so this was very strange. When I was baptized, I was told to walk into the back area of the stage where I would wait to make my entrance into the baptismal pool. As I opened the door from the back area, I was greeted by a guy who was wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a straw fedora, holding a towel. He was just sitting there on a wooden box with a cane. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but then I realized that he was sitting at least 3 feet from the ground with his feet in the air. I figured that he must have been a spry old man, but at the same time I was confused as to why he was holding a cane in the first place. He handed me the towel and told me not to worry and not to be nervous. It was very warming and relaxing hearing him tell me that. Afterwards, I heard the cue for my name and went out, and I was baptized. When I was done changing, I walked into my minister's office and asked who the guy was. She had no idea who I was talking about, but as she said that, I immediately noticed a portrait on the wall of the man who had given me the towel. In the portrait, he was wearing a suit instead, but the face was definitely the same. I pointed at the photo and said, "Him. Who's that guy? Is he the chairman of the board?" She said, "No, he's a founding member of this church. He passed away a long time ago." I was so baffled. I told her it had to have been him, that it had just happened no less than 20 minutes ago. I went back to the place where he was, and there was a shelf of blankets and towels sitting on top of the box that he was sitting on. All I could think of in total shock was that there was no way that old man had propped that up there by himself in the last 15 minutes, and I quickly prayed and thanked him. After that, I've never had a similar experience. I still only ever encounter negative energy-driven entities in shadows, not pure ones, like him. I'm going to start this out by giving some background on my mother. She's currently 58, a nurse, and a devoted Christian. Other than the occasional drink, she doesn't do anything to alter her mind. This story begins one day when my mom laid down for a nap. The way she described it, she wasn't asleep, but she began to see a video of sorts repeating in her head as soon as she closed her eyes. She saw a young teenage girl dressed in a schoolgirl outfit, floating away in a boat and waving. My mom could feel her emotions, her sadness and worry for her grandmother as she said goodbye. She could feel that this girl was going to a peaceful place. As well as this, she saw a calendar turn 3 times. This vision repeated itself once or twice, until my mother came to. She thought it was a vision of our family friend Shannon, but it didn't look quite like her. Later on, during the month of March, there was a shooting at a local rave. Shannon's younger sister was shot and killed. She was wearing the exact schoolgirl outfit that my mother saw her in during the vision. The fact that it happened in March means that the calendar was a warning of what was to come. We are unsure of why exactly my mom was meant to see this, but we were able to provide some comfort to the family by letting them know that she was somewhere safe and peaceful. This story takes place in 2017. My then best friend, I'll call her Lex, and I were having a sleepover at my dad's house. I was 16 at the time, her being 17. We often had sleepovers on Fridays where we would eat junk food, watch as much Netflix as possible, and have deep conversations. This night was no different, and so unremarkable that I've forgotten everything that we did. That is, of course, until we were trying to fall asleep in my bed. I remember being completely exhausted, slowly but surely drifting off despite sharing a bed with someone. I was just on the brink of sleep when Lex got my attention. First, she simply asked if I was awake. I grunted in response, signaling for her to continue. It should be said that I was quite literally a minute or two away from unconsciousness, so I didn't pick up on her tone of voice or think much about what she said next. "I'm gonna go use the bathroom downstairs," she told me, getting off the bed. This wasn't normal, her announcing that she would be slipping away to use the restroom, but I was too out of it to be annoyed or curious. Not long after she left, probably no more than 10 seconds, it started happening. Again, I was on the precipice of sleep, so my mind wasn't racing with thoughts or in any state to freak myself out. Nevertheless, I became filled with the feeling of impending danger out of absolutely nowhere. I was becoming very lucid very quickly as dread and anxiety overwhelmed me. I had never felt this kind of acute fear before, nor seemingly out of nowhere. Now wide awake, I opened my eyes and stared at the wall. Less than a foot away from my face, as I slept facing away from the bedroom door. My heart raced as I tried to understand the situation, but I didn't move. Something told me that moving would be a very bad idea. My room was pitch black as well, so that didn't help matters. All I could think about was how scared I was, and how I hoped that Lex would return soon. I can guess that a few minutes passed like this when suddenly the bed dipped on the side that I wasn't occupying, as if someone were sitting down. Problem was, not only did Lex struggle to get onto my bed due to its height, but my bedroom door had never opened. At this point I was petrified, and I only became more afraid as I felt something against the back of my body. It felt like a person, just gently pressed against me. I thought to myself hysterically that there was no way this was actually happening. I held my breath to better isolate the feeling, horrified to feel the presence moving as if it were breathing, too. In and out, pressed against me. In and out. The atmosphere is still suffocating in the room, filled with what I can only describe as evilness. The aura of whatever was touching me screamed danger. Don't move. I will hurt you. My mind and heart are racing as I try to think of a way out of this. The only balm I have to lessen my anxiety is the fact that I know Lex will eventually return. But what happens then? She wouldn't see whatever it was pressed against me when she entered the bedroom, too occupied with making sure she wasn't disturbing my sleep. So I told myself that once I heard the door open, I would address her and ask her to turn on the lights. After what I would come to find out was about half an hour, Lex finally did return. The second I heard the door open and light flooded into the bedroom, I called her name. She hesitated, her soft voice saying, "Yeah?" I requested bluntly, "Turn on the lights." She did as I asked, and I shot like a bullet from my previous position, whipping around to inspect the area where I had felt the presence. There was nothing. I wouldn't notice right away, but later I realized that the horrifying aura that was plaguing my bedroom had vanished once Lex arrived. It was gone just as suddenly as it had appeared. Still, I was in a state of horror for the next few hours. We watched some cartoons together and decided to sleep with the lights on, but not before talking about what had just happened. Lex revealed to me that the reason she had gone downstairs wasn't to use the restroom, but to call her boyfriend for emotional support. She told me that she had felt panicked, wanting to leave the room to escape from the stifling feeling. Lex couldn't get a hold of him, and spent the next 30 minutes or so trying to calm herself down. In the morning, Lex and I would confide in my dad, the only other person in the house. He was rightly disturbed and told us that he had a nightmare that night. I can't remember what his nightmare consisted of, only that it was a really bad one. My dad is a veteran, so he is not easily spooked, but it left him uneasy. The fact that my dad had a nightmare at all made this whole experience more notable to me. To wrap things up, I want to say that I had improperly used a spirit board a few years before this with a few of my friends at my dad's house. We were children, so we didn't take it any more seriously than any other Halloween game. Nothing of this magnitude had ever occurred before, though. Just this one night. Lex and I were able to acquire holy water from one of the teachers at our high school after she told him the story. We used it to cleanse my bedroom. Nothing strange has happened to me, or my dad, since. My family and I lived at a large property called Gladstone Villa in the former mining town of Bargoed, in the Caerphilly County Borough of the South Wales Valleys in the UK. From 1969 to 1978, we experienced activity that simply defied rational explanation, such as lights going off and on. We witnessed electrical cables being pulled, and my grandfather Bill claimed to have had a glass bottle thrown towards him as he entered the main bedroom, missing him by inches. I didn't personally see this myself, but I still recall the time he came from there with the broken bottle in his hands, and he told us what happened. There was the occasional sighting, but this was very rare indeed, so rare that in all the 9 years I was there, I never once saw it. But I did hear it many times in the bedroom. It's still worth mentioning that my mother, Caroline, saw it on at least 2 occasions. There were also regular footsteps heard in the main bedroom every evening. Sometimes during the day we'd all be downstairs watching TV. One of us would turn the volume down to hear it more clearly, and my grandfather Bill would point to the ceiling and say, "He's by there," or "He's by there now," trying to make out where the footsteps were coming from exactly. There were 5 members of the family that were living at the Gladstone Villa. My maternal grandfather was William Higgs, known as Bill to family and friends, a retired miner who worked at the local colliery. He was a short, bald man who liked nothing more than to listen to his country and western LPs, Johnny Cash, Glenn Campbell, and so on. He also liked westerns on TV that starred John Wayne or Clint Eastwood. My maternal grandmother was Rita Higgs. She was a short woman who was a housewife. She was completely teetotal, but liked to smoke. She also liked collecting garden gnomes and liked watching soap operas on TV. My mother, Caroline Dexter, met my father at the local bakehouse on Baldwin Street. She was day shift regularly, and my father worked the night shift. He would stay behind to make her a cup of tea and chat. They dated for 3 years before they got married on Monday, the 1st of April, 1968. The Beatles were number 1 with Lady Madonna. They did not get a place of their own, but they decided to live with my grandparents at Gladstone Villa, which was in Cardiff Road. I was born on August 24th, 1969, when everyone was listening to the latest number 1 in the charts, Honky Tonk Woman, by the Rolling Stones. It was soon after that my mother said that strange things started to happen. I was just a baby when she said it all started off rather quietly, like small tapping here and there, but nothing too noticeable. But in time, the activity gradually increased. One time, my mother said the family heard a noise like someone jumping down from the attic and onto the landing. Naturally thinking that someone was trying to break in, they went to see what was going on. When they got there, they found no one, but the latch to the attic was open. Whatever it was eventually occupied itself in the main bedroom, which incidentally was my grandparents' room. It soon made its presence felt by walking around the bedroom, and the sounds of dragging could be heard. One day, my mother went upstairs to that bedroom to get my father up for work so he could be ready for his night shift. When she got there, she was confronted by the sight of the ironing board placed on my father's torso as he slept. When he awoke, he was astonished to find the situation he was in. He suspected my grandfather Bill was playing pranks, but in time he knew my grandfather was not responsible for it, and he told his work friends what was going on, and it got around town that Gladstone Villa was haunted. My parents separated in 1972, and my father left Gladstone Villa, but it wasn't because of what was going on at the villa. It was just a breakdown of the marriage. They finally divorced on the 25th of April, 1975. The British band the Bay City Rollers were number 1 in the charts with Bye Bye Bay. Again, very apt. It would have been amusing but for the fact of what was going on there. I was barely 2 years old, so I have no memory of my father living at the villa. But he would come to see me every Saturday to take me to see my paternal grandparents and to the local cinema. Great times, even though the paranormal activity still continued. As I got older, too, I witnessed the activity for myself. I actually saw the poltergeist activity. I watched electrical cables being pulled by unseen forces. I saw the lights going on and off, and when my grandfather Bill would play records on Sunday as the family did dinner, it would turn the music off. It took exception to the British band Slade and any religious TV shows my grandmother Rita would watch. The local police were also involved. I remember them popping their heads into the attic, hesitating and not going in, but they suggested it was my father playing a prank on the family. A family friend, Mrs. Ivy France, she was more of a friend to my grandmother Rita, she was very skeptical when my grandmother told her that Gladstone Villa was haunted. I can remember Ivy going into the main bedroom, looking around and saying it was vibration from the traffic outside causing it, but she was soon to change her mind when she experienced it for herself. It was then she suggested that the local press be contacted, and a medium. The medium was John Matthews, and when he came to Gladstone Villa, he started by asking the family questions. He then began by challenging the spirit to perform by knocking on the ceiling, and sure enough, it responded by knocking back at him. At some point, John went into a trance to try to make contact with it, but he failed to get a name. He later confirmed the obvious, that there was indeed a presence there, and that it was an earthbound spirit, and that it had unfinished business. A priest by the name of Graham Jones was then called to Gladstone Villa. He blessed the property, and after a few prayers, he duly left, and it was quiet for a few short months after that. No incidents. But it did return, and with a vengeance, and this time it decided to show itself. One evening, my grandfather Bill, my mother Caroline, and I were watching television. My grandmother Rita was reading a book, when all of a sudden my mother just so happened to look to her left, and she saw a full, solid figure of a monk standing by the doorway. We did not see this, as we were otherwise occupied, but she later described it in detail as a monk in typical brown habit, complete with hood over the head so she didn't see the face. It sounded very much like a 16th century Benedictine monk. Fred Davies was a friend of my grandfather Bill. They worked together at the local colliery, and he would visit most evenings. Fred was a slim man who would wear a flat cap and glasses and smoked homemade cigarettes that hung from his lips as he spoke. He would sit in his favorite chair by the open fire and talk to the family and watch TV with us. One day, Fred was with us, in his casual place by the open fire. I was quietly playing with my toys by the sideboard. It was tranquil, when all of a sudden there was one very loud bang. It was so loud that Fred ducked his head and I ran to my mother for comfort. When it was gone, we all went upstairs. My grandfather, Bill, would always be the first and I would be the last. When we went to that bedroom, we found nothing that could account for that noise. Fred later told us that he ducked his head as he thought it was going to come through the ceiling. Fred told us of another experience he had at Gladstone Villa. My grandfather Bill liked to look out the landing window that overlooked Cardiff Road and into the Bargoed town centre. This time Fred joined him, and he said that he felt something brush past him, but when he looked, there was nothing there. The most frightening experience I had was when I was alone in that particular bedroom. I made sure the light was on. It was very quiet as usual. I was lying on the bed facing the window that overlooked Cardiff Road when I suddenly felt something heavy pounce on the bottom of the bed. I heard the bed springs go just once, and I felt the bed bounce. I didn't look straight away, but when I did, there was nothing there. I went downstairs to tell my family, and we all went back up. We saw distinctive paw marks on the bed, like that of an animal. I later found out that my grandfather had a black Labrador dog called Toby, who died before I was born. My grandfather Bill and my mother Caroline claimed to have heard a baby crying there, but as I didn't hear it at the time, I took very little notice of what they said. The activity got so bad that my mother, grandmother, and I slept downstairs with the lights on. It was only my grandfather Bill who was supposedly brave enough to sleep in the bedroom itself. It was then that he himself had yet another experience. He told us that he was lying on the bed when all of a sudden he couldn't move. He couldn't even shout for us to help him. This could well have been sleep paralysis, but he said that he heard something in the room with him. My grandmother Rita had her own experiences. One day she went upstairs into that room to get my grandfather up when she saw the boiler door open wide by itself. She didn't stay there to see what it was, but she rushed out. Another occasion, she said she had the sense of something pulling from under her foot, as if she had stepped on someone's gown. We had the ghost for so long that my grandmother Rita gave it a pet name. She called him Johnny, and my grandfather Bill would shout out that name to provoke a reaction, but nothing would happen. Ivy Francis's son, Charles, got to hear about what was going on at the Gladstone Villa, and he came along with some friends, and with my family's permission, they went into the bedroom. It frightened one of his friends, and to this day, his friend still says that it is a spooky place. My mother Caroline had an operation on her and ended up on crutches. The local nurse would tend to her foot. One day she was sitting on a chair when the nurse came, and the nurse knelt down to tend to her, and she told my mother not to hold her. My mother looked at my grandmother Rita in amazement, as she was not holding the nurse at all. My mother made her own conclusions that it was Johnny the ghost that was holding her, so as not for the nurse to hurt her. The only time I heard the ghost being vocal was the time that we were all in the room. One of us wanted to use the bathroom and we couldn't get in there. My grandfather Bill said, "He's behind there." I heard quite distinctively the sound of a Gregorian chant, and that was it. Nothing more. We left in the summer of 1978, when two local businessmen bought the property, and Gladstone Villa was eventually converted into a small hotel and its name changed to Red's Park Hotel. On the night before we moved, there was one final incident that we experienced, as if it knew that we were going, and that was its way of saying goodbye. My mother, grandmother, and I got ready to go to sleep. The light was still on, and then we heard the doorknob turning as if someone were trying to get in. At first, I naturally suspected my grandfather Bill, as he was the only one who slept upstairs in that room, and we thought it may have been him playing a prank. I called out to him, but there was no answer, no laugh that would give him away. We then heard our belongings that were packed in the hallway being thrown around. The next day, we asked my grandfather Bill if it was him playing a joke on us. He insisted that it wasn't him, and to this very day, I believe him. I had my 40th birthday at Red's Park Hotel in August of 2009 for old time's sake, and it was the female staff that told me about the ghost, and I told them what had happened to me there 30 years before. The staff told me of their own personal experiences, lights going off and on, the odd sighting in a room, a bridge, a bride in white was seen. Again, as with the claims of the baby crying that made no sense to me at the time. I did a thorough research of the property in the Cardiff Road area, and I found out some very interesting things indeed. I found out from the Bargood Library and the local newspaper archives that Gladstone Villa dates back to 1900, and it was named after the former British Prime Minister William Gladstone. I discovered the previous people that lived there. The Kimyett family in 1924, the new married couple Michael and Evelyn Kimyett, and a son named Elvin. He died at the property at just 4 months old, according to the archives of the Cardiff newspaper The Western Mail of that year. This explained the baby my mother and grandfather had heard in that bedroom so long ago. Mrs. Evelyn Kimyett died in 1970, soon after I was born. Maybe this is why all the activity started. I also found that there was a monastery in Baldwin Street, where my parents met and worked, and there's a property directly opposite the former Gladstone Villa property in Cardiff Road dating back to the 16th century. It is now a public house called the Rafa Club. A priest hide is said to be there, but it's sealed up. This explains the monk that my mother saw. What I have said here is true. I wouldn't share this if I couldn't possibly back this up, and I have used real names, as I have nothing to hide, and all I have said can be verified by the family of those people that I mentioned. Sadly, some of the people I've mentioned are no longer with us. I challenge any hardened skeptic and firm non-believer, and I can assure them that they will indeed, most certainly, question their belief system. Of this, I have no doubt at all whatsoever. In fact, I am 100% positive. During the past few years, my gifts of clairvoyancy have developed further, which has created some moments where I truly have questioned my sanity. Former teachers of mine have communicated to me from beyond their grave. 2 of them have led me to where they are buried, and I have predicted 3 district deaths. The first teacher to come through was actually a nurse from the local school, followed by my 6th grade social studies teacher. I was aware that the nurse had passed away in 2012, so I wasn't surprised when she came through. However, I was unaware of the second one passing, and immediately went into denial mode. Eventually, through clues via dreams and meditation, I was able to locate her final resting place. I went from being in denial to being absolutely speechless. I followed the clues that she gave me, and there I was, at her grave. It was at that moment that I realized that what I was dealing with was reality, and that I was not losing my mind. The creepy thing is the numbers of her plot are the same as the numbers in the school district where she taught. As I was visiting her on March 1st, 2017, I had a flash or image prediction about another former teacher passing away, and they would be buried in the same cemetery. On March 6th, another one of my 6th grade teachers passed away, and a few days later they were buried in the same cemetery. The process repeated itself, and he led me to where he is buried. That isn't the only death or dreams, visions that I've had. I've had 2 others. One was in December of 2016, hours after the teacher passed away, and one was in June 2017, 6 months prior to her passing. There seems to be no time structure when it comes to dreams or visions, and the time of passing itself. It ranges in hours after to 6 months before. A couple of months ago I had another dream, and while nothing has happened as of yet, I am very concerned. Years ago, during a church event that I was forced to attend, we all had a terrifying experience. The setup was that boys slept anywhere they wanted to downstairs, and the girls were free to sleep wherever they wanted to upstairs. Some rooms were locked off, however, as the church was being renovated at the time. Anyway, it didn't matter too much, because we were just a small group. Night rolled around and us girls migrated into the nursery while most of the guys crashed in the indoor gym/basketball court. Only one guy couldn't sleep. Above the basketball court are windows to another room that was locked off, and the guy kept seeing flashing lights as well as the silhouettes of people looking at him. He didn't stay in the gym for very long. About the same time, myself and the other girls were still in the nursery. At that moment, we were playing apples to apples. The door was closed, and next to it was a one-way window. Inside was like a mirror. It was so that kids didn't see their parents coming to check on them and make a fuss. Well, I started hearing banging and scratching on the door. I freaked out and looked up to see two grinning faces staring back at all of us. Remember, we were on the mirror side of the one-way window. One of us bolted toward the door, and we heard stomping down the hall, but no one was there. The pastor came up screaming at us, saying that we were all just imagining things. We know what we saw, though, as well as heard, and all of us refuse to go back. I used to work as a cleaner when I was 16 and between colleges. This is the UK, so I had already left school. The place where I worked was a popular clothing store near my house and was built over ancient farmland. There were also rumors of druid burial grounds nearby, but that's another story. I've always been sensitive to the paranormal from a very young age, but this was by far the most haunted place I've ever worked, and my first apparition sighting. We were a team of 4 to 5 people, and all of us were assigned to different parts of the store. One of the sections was the women's fitting rooms. We would vacuum the rugs and cubicles, polish the mirrors, and all of that. You would hear high heels on the tiles the whole time that you were down there, and the sounds of rustling paper, coat hangers rattling, that kind of thing. There was also a general feeling of discomfort and unease, as though you were being followed and watched. This is hours before the store opened, so of course there were no customers. Sometimes a manager would be there, but they stayed upstairs in the office. The next part was the men's clothing area, which was on the 2nd floor. When you cleaned there, you were alone but for the occasional manager walking through. One time I was on the floor cleaning the railings by the cash registers, and a huge black shadow swept over me. I was surprised because I hadn't heard anybody approach, and as I looked around, I was definitely alone. My cleaning routine was to sweep the floor and collect the dirt into little piles around the pillars, then sweep it up all in one go at the end. The dirt piles moved constantly. I would go back to do the final big sweep, and some of the piles always would have disappeared. After I clocked out, the piles would be there again. I had a sense that the spirit was a young male farmhand who was very mischievous. I said as much to my coworker, and she told me that she refuses to clean in that area after polishing the mirrors one day and seeing the disembodied head of a young man peering over her shoulder. Aside from my instances with the piles, I would always hear the sound of coat hangers rattling and shuffling noises, but I never felt threatened by it. I used to laugh it off or just tell the spirit to stop, and he would most of the time. Now, after the store was clean, we would clean the staff quarters. Toilets and canteen, meeting rooms. The toilets were a non-paranormal horror in themselves. Note, I worked here with my mother. We were assigned to clean the female toilets, and usually if someone was using them, we would leave and give them privacy until they finished. So we went in, the middle stall was closed, and we heard rustling paper and heavy breathing. So we left and waited. And waited. And waited. The cleaning cupboard was right next to the toilets, and didn't even have a door. We would have seen and heard anybody who might have left. To leave and enter the toilets, you would have to walk straight past the open doorway and then walk down the corridor that directly faced it. It was an L-shaped corridor, with the toilets on the far end and the cleaning cupboard on the corner. Except when we went in after waiting 10 to 15 minutes, the middle stall door was wide open and empty. Now, on to the apparition. The children's clothing area was generally less creepy. There were coat hangers moving again. Sometimes things would fall off the shelves and rails, but we always just shrugged it off. The elevator was directly opposite the children's clothing, and we usually loaded our cleaning equipment into the elevator because it was too heavy to carry up the stairs. I remember rinsing my mop out, and I glanced up. There was a little boy around 6 or 7 years old, standing directly in front of me. He wore a flat cap, a pale shirt with suspenders, dark shorts, and socks up to his knees. At first I thought it was a mannequin, and when I blinked, he was gone. I thought I was just tired, and I shook my head. I spoke to my mother about it later, as she's Wiccan and super into the supernatural, and I described the boy to her. She had seen the exact same child a few weeks before, but only the back of him, as if he had been walking around a corner. She told me that she had the feeling he had died of lung-related issues, perhaps tuberculosis or pneumonia. So there you have it. Some of it can be explained by tiredness, I know, but I just thought I would share this experience. Since the pandemic, the church my parents attend has been recording their Sunday morning worship earlier in the week, and then the minister will edit and publish it on social media on the actual service day. This past Wednesday, we recorded the worship music. I'm one of the 3 singers that we have, and my mom is the pianist. While in the middle of recording our first song, we all hear a man yell, "Stop." I look over in the direction that it came from, somewhere off stage to my left. See nothing, and then we just finish up the song. After we finish the song, one of the other singers goes, "Did you hear that?" All 5 of us, including our other instrumentalist, my mom, and the 3 singers, all said yes. The saxophone player was suggesting that it was a wrong note that we had played, or possibly a weird squeak as the building settled. None of us were really convinced, though. Fast forward to this Sunday. My mom and I watched the service and realized that the noise couldn't have been from the sax because the sax has a microphone and would have been very audible on the video. We noticed where the 2 of us looked over at the noise, and we even replayed that section a couple of times with the volume raised. Both of us could hear it, just barely, beneath the sound of the music. This was by far the freakiest thing that I have ever experienced in that church, and none of us will ever be finding ourselves alone in that building again. I'm going to tell about my experience, but for certain reasons I will not be naming anyone specifically. It was 2014. I was 13 years old at the time, and my great-grandmother was in a nursing home as her mental health had started to slip and as my great-aunt and uncle couldn't take care of her anymore. I remember the last time that I had seen her in person. It was a sunny January afternoon, and me, my parents, grandparents, and my aunt and uncle had decided to talk outside as opposed to the sad, depressing clinical interior of the nursing home. Despite my great-grandmother having memory issues, she recognized me right away and told me specifically hello. It's March of 2014, and during the night, I'm having memory flashbacks of things that me and my great-grandmother used to do, like stringing long strands of old-fashioned buttons, or the time I had my first ever garden-grown tomato raw, sitting on the porch swing with her while my grandfather worked in the field. I remember waking up that morning and asking, almost demanding my mother to call the nursing home, or my great-aunt and uncle, and she called them while I took a shower. After I got done, my mother informed me that my grandmother had indeed passed away from old age. I spent the rest of the day walking around our house in an almost trance-like state. I've had a few paranormal experiences in my lifetime. My mom and dad said that when I was little, they would wake up in the middle of the night to me crawling around my nursery and saying a man with glowing eyes was playing with me. They believed it was my grandfather who died when I was born a hallway away, but I haven't seen him since. Anyway, my boyfriend used to live in an old farmhouse built back in the late 1800s with roommates. None of them believed in activity, but I asked about the old barns in the house when I was staying there, I always felt unsettled in the house when I would sleep there and often would wake up at around 3:12 a.m. to pee. But one night I woke up at that time and stumbled down the hall to the bathroom. At the end of the hall was the staircase, which was creaky and old, and I heard it shift. I stopped at the bathroom door and saw the face of an older man peer around the corner. I jumped into the bathroom and shut the door to pee, but felt goosebumps all up my arms and my back. I didn't feel afraid of him. He looked pretty nervous, but it spooked me really bad. I went back to bed and didn't see him again. The next time I stayed there, I woke up at the same time to pee, and I saw him standing against the wall. But this time, he actually reached his hand out to me and motioned to go downstairs. I cautiously went towards him to see him go downstairs, and I peered around the corner to see him facing the door with his hands behind his back and staring at the open field in front of him. This time I noticed that he was wearing glasses and was older, with a scruffy white beard and dirty pants and boots like he'd been working outside. My boyfriend came down and found me, so I went back to bed, but didn't sleep at all. The last time I saw him, I woke up at 3:12 yet again and rubbed my eyes to feel a really warm sensation around my hand, as though someone with really strong, working hands was grabbing me with both of their hands, but I sat up to see nothing. My heart was beating loud, but I felt safe and calm, and I swear I heard the whisper, "I'll miss you," before I went to look for him. He was in the hallway again, and he tipped his cap before whistling and walking away. I followed him, but didn't see him anywhere, and this was the last night we stayed there before we moved to a different town, into our own home. As crazy as this sounds, I miss him, and he was a sweet soul. I hope the boys that live there don't bother him too much. I asked about him after we left and visited my boyfriend's friends, and they said their grandfather had died before they were alive, and he was a working farmer whose wife died before him. He loved animals and wore big bottle glasses. I really think it was him, and that since the boys didn't believe in ghosts, that he just wanted someone to be his friend. On May 9th of this year, I went to a flea market to browse. I passed by a clear cabinet that held an assortment of old antique dolls, and I was particularly drawn to an old, cracked doll wearing a hat with feathers. As I examined her closer, I noticed that she had a cloth body, but her arms, head, and legs were made of the same type of plastic, or possibly porcelain. I felt very drawn to her and was surprised by her price, only $35. She wasn't in very good condition, and was clearly ancient based on the cracks on her body and the way that her face is painted on. I returned to the cashier with the doll, and immediately the workers who had been deep in conversation halted and fell quiet. They proceeded to tell me a little more about the doll, who supposedly hexes anyone who inconveniences her. This only made me feel more inclined to purchase her, as someone who is very interested in the paranormal, and as it is part of my faith, Wicca. So I ended up buying her. My younger sister, 11, wasn't very happy that I had bought the doll, whose name was Madame Leonora. She felt very thrown off by the doll's presence and requested that the doll be placed in the trunk on the ride home. I didn't want to upset the doll in case I got hexed, but my parents insisted that I put the doll in the trunk. So I did. That same day, I almost went to the hospital after an accident at my home. Similar disturbing events happened around the home whenever someone insulted Madame or did something she didn't like. These events pose a possible trauma trigger for some people, so I won't specify what the events were here. Just know that they were serious, and they were awful. I began giving Madame gifts and saying good morning and good night to her every day. On the first day that I gave her a gift, a package that I hadn't been expecting for another 2 weeks came in the mail. Every time I give her a gift, she gives me good luck. Madame and I had formed a friendship, but towards late June I began having strange, very specific dreams. In these dreams, Madame would climb down off of the shelf where she lives and escort me outside. We'd light candles and perform a ritual, and then I would bury Madame in a box with the gifts that I had given her over the months. As soon as the dream ends, I wake up. So, with the knowledge that I have because of my Wiccan faith, I decided to hold a seance of sorts in order to communicate with the spirit hosting my doll. I lit a candle and used a pendulum with a board to communicate. The candle flame responded to everything I said, and I have never seen such clear responses through my pendulum before. Based on what I got out of the session, Madame was able to tell me that she would like to be buried, but won't reveal to me why. I've never sensed any negative energy around Madame before, but with each passing day, the air in my room feels heavier, if that makes any sense. I'd like to fulfill her wish and bury her because I think she may be a Victorian mourning doll, but the vendors who sold her have no information on her at all, only that she makes bad things happen. If she is indeed a Victorian mourning doll, it would make sense why she wants to be buried. The only problem is that she refuses to tell me why I have to bury her. If anyone can tell me if there's any danger to burying her, if there's anything I should know about this, or what I can do to identify what time period she's from, I'd really appreciate the help. Most of this stuff happened to me between the ages of 10 and 18. I've posted before about my haunted school, and I'd like to share more of what I've heard. Whatever these things are, they have really enjoyed screwing with me periodically. I was 17 and had just gotten home from some event, either with a church group or some friends, I don't recall. It was about 11 p.m., and as mandated, I woke my parents up to let them know that I was home and alive. Don't remember why I felt the need to shower that night, but I did. The shower was a stall with a glass door and really high-pressure steam, which was almost deafening in that plastic stall. You would have to shout at me right next to the bathroom door in order for me to hear you, so that's why what happened next was so shocking. Mid-shower, there was this loud, blood-curdling female scream that I could hear from inside the shower. I had never heard someone scream like that in real life, and it paralyzed me for a second. I have 2 sisters, and so I immediately thought the worst. I busted out of the shower, ran to my parents' room dripping wet, wearing only a towel, fully expecting my parents to be getting up to see who was screaming. The house wasn't that big, just a double-wide trailer with an addition. I was shocked to find them in bed asleep still. Their door was open. If I heard the scream, then they should have really heard it, especially since neither of them are heavy sleepers. I woke them quickly and asked if they had heard that scream, which they didn't. Mom was concerned and Dad hopped out of bed and we checked on my siblings. All sound asleep. So then we searched the house and even looked outside. Nothing. He usually gets annoyed and upset when I talk about the paranormal. He had to exorcise some evil spirit from a room when he was on his mission at age 20, so he prefers to have them just not exist at our house at all. and no scary movies. But this time he was pretty calm, probably because he could tell how upset that I was. I wasn't dreaming, hallucinating, or making it up, and he knew it. I was standing naked with a towel, nearly hyperventilating and still dripping from the shower. Dad tried to comfort me, telling me it was probably just a cat outside. Yeah, really. He didn't believe it, but that's what he was selling, so I better buy it. I really had nothing else to do but go to bed, down in the basement where most of the activity occurred, but you bet your butt I didn't sleep much. Whatever it was that was screaming would bug me periodically. I was the only one in the basement, so naturally, I was the only witness. I have lots of stories that my family still won't believe. This may have been a huge coincidence, but last January I applied for my grandfather's military service records. He died in 1981, way before I was born. I applied for his records and didn't think anything more of it. Several months went by, and I assumed that things were just moving slowly. 6 months later, without hearing any news of his records arriving, one night I had a very vivid dream. I don't often remember my dreams anymore. In my dream, I was in a very white, very bare room with high walls and a high ceiling. On a small table in front of me was a box, and inside was my grandfather's military service history. The dream simply revolved around my taking a good look through them, nothing too exciting. The next morning I wake up and remember the dream, maybe around an hour after I got up. 10 minutes later, a large envelope drops through my letterbox. It was my grandfather's service records. Odd? Just coincidence? A second, much stranger event occurred on the evening when my grandmother passed away. She had passed in the early morning and had been taken to the chapel of rest, which was not too far from the apartment where I was living. That evening, my parents invited me and my girlfriend for a dinner to celebrate her life. In the car, as we drove past the chapel, a leaf landed on the windscreen. The leaf was a perfect heart shape, upside down, so that the light from the streets illuminated the perfectness of the heart shape onto the car's dashboard. The leaf stayed on the windscreen for a minute or so, and right as we turned away and out of our town, it blew off and back toward the chapel itself. I do have a video of the leaf and the heart on the windshield. For a while afterward, shuffling footsteps and noises kept occurring in my parents' house, and they sounded exactly how my grandmother used to walk. We all heard them moving across the upstairs landing. After around 2 weeks, it stopped, and has never happened since. Odd, strangely comforting, and food for thought for a semi-skeptic who finds the subject of the paranormal fascinating. About 5 years ago, I had just moved into a new house with my wife at the time. We had 2 kids, ages 2.5 and 1. My 2.5-year-old was very articulate for his age, and so one day as we were walking out the front door, he points across the house and asks, "Mommy, who's that little girl right there?" Well, my wife and I just kind of froze, because he was the kind of kid that had never made up any imaginary friends, or anything like that. But the moment passed, and we kind of forgot about it. Around 6 to 8 months later, I remember I was in my bedroom late at night. I have a large window in my bedroom that looks out into my backyard. I also had a couple strings of lights overhead that illuminated the yard perfectly. One night I was up studying for a class the next day when I looked outside and saw that my kid's swing set had one swing going back and forth in a perfect pendulum motion like someone was on it, while the swing next to it was dead still. This was not the first time this has happened. It was actually the third, I think. But it was the instance that I remember the most clearly and took the most notice. I honestly have no idea why I didn't think to tell my wife or to take a video, but I just stood there in the window and watched it for a couple minutes, and it kept up perfect consistency. I grabbed my flashlight and walked out to my deck to get a better look. Still swinging. I had been studying lots of science classes at that point, so my head was in the space of, I'm going to figure out the rational explanation of why this is happening. It was breezy out, so I walked up to the swing set and held my hand in different places around the swinging swing, and no breeze. Plus, again, the swing next to it was dead still. Also, my thought was that if it was the wind, there was no way that it could keep a perfect back and forth motion. If a swing gets even a little off, it would have collided with the one next to it. Anyway, I'm not sure if I had a previous encounter with my son in mind or not, but I had a very certain feeling at that moment that there was a little girl swinging on the swing. Almost like I could see her, but obviously couldn't. I also felt very at ease and not frightened at all. Then after about 5 to 10 minutes, I stopped the swing just to see what would happen, and it remained stopped. I remembered apologizing out loud to the girl for stopping the swing, and told her that she could swing whenever she wanted to, but it never happened again after that, and I haven't had any additional encounters at this house since. I looked up public records and asked the landlord if there was ever any little girl that had died in this house, and nothing. The only info that I could collect is that a few years before we moved in, there was an elderly woman who lived here for about 20 years, but the owner had the landlord kick her out in fear that she would die on the property, so she had to move in with family a few states away. Anyways, I would love to hear your thoughts on this one. For a little background, my mother has been in a long-term nursing facility since March, with some serious but stable health issues. Then there was a virus outbreak in her facility, and she was diagnosed with it. I of course worried for her condition as she began to decline rather quickly over the beginning of last week. Last Wednesday, I switched off my light at 10 p.m. like most nights, rolled over, and began to doze off. Typically when I'm dozing, my mind will follow some random train of thought that will lead me off into snooze land. That night, as I was dozing, I envisioned my mother walking into my late father's arms, being hugged by my older brother who had died 9 years ago, and having my grandparents and aunt gather around her while being hugged by my father. Then the phone woke me up at 10:30 p.m. The hospice nurse called to tell me that my mother had passed away at 10:15. I like to think that I was seeing her entry into heaven, with my family's love and long-missed affection return to bring her to happiness. I work in an Alzheimer's unit. Most of the residents don't stay around for very long because they're on hospice, so basically I barely get to know them, and before I know it, they've passed away. One resident we had did not have dementia, but schizophrenia. Her sister stuck her in there as more of a convenience for herself rather than considering her sister's mental health. The resident was extremely bright, and remembered silly things that even I couldn't recall that had happened. Once COVID hit, she decided life wasn't worth living, and that she would never get better. She starved herself to death. It was heartbreaking, and she suffered many delusions and manic episodes during her last days. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened the month following her passing, until the fire alarm went off out of nowhere during lunch. My coworker and I immediately went to guard the outside doors since they would unlock automatically once the fire alarm was triggered. We assumed it was another drill and were annoyed that it had happened at such a busy time of the day. On my way to the back door, I popped my head into each room just to make sure that everything was clear. When I came to that empty room, the minute that I opened the door, it was frigid. I assumed that it was normal since the room was empty and thought nothing more of it. I stood by the back door and waited for the alarm to stop. My boss came back with a concerned look on his face and told me that the alarm system said that it was coming from the room where that resident had just recently passed. I explained to him that that would be impossible because I had just checked and there was no sign of a fire. The alarm continued to go haywire for another 30 minutes, even when shut off. It was extremely bizarre. Afterward, I had asked out loud if it was our resident who had just passed, and it felt like a warm bucket of water was dumped over my head, and I couldn't resist the urge to cry. The kind of crying and sobbing that hurts your entire body. Sometimes she opens the fire extinguisher box to remind me that she's still around. You need a key and a strong arm to crank that box open. Anyway, I found it open again today after doing rounds, and was reminded of this experience. A few years ago, me and a buddy from the army decided to meet and catch up. We decided on the date and place. After several hours at the local pub, it was 3 a.m. We had 3 beers each and decided to go pay our respects to a friend of ours who had died a few years ago and was with us in the army. We bought a bottle of our friend's favorite booze and drove toward the graveyard. When we got there and started to walk toward the gate, we both saw someone standing there. As we got closer, I could definitely recognize the very friend that we were going to visit. He was standing there in his uniform holding a rifle and was waving at us to come closer. I was incredibly freaked out by what I was seeing. I just turned to my friend and looked at him and asked him if he was seeing the same thing. He was so shocked that he couldn't even talk and was just nodding his head with his mouth open. We backed away slowly and went back to the car and drove away as fast as we could from there. Where I'm from, they say never go close if you see the dead calling you over. But ever since that day, I keep hearing someone call my name behind me when I'm all alone. At first I thought it was my wife messing with me, but that's not possible, because it's a male voice. Once again, I'm really freaking out. A few times I left my phone recording on all night to prove to my wife that I'm not going insane. But every time I do it, there's zero evidence. Just static and me and my wife snoring in the background. My grandparents' house is haunted. Strange things happen all the time. We've gotten used to it over the years. I've seen people walking along the hallway. My mom has seen legs walk up the stairs. And my grandparents have both heard what they thought was me shout from the back of the house telling them that I was home, when I was 7 hours away in my own home. That's just a few of the things that have gone on. It's quite an active house to live in. My sister is only 13, and was doing what most kids her age do. She was dancing around the kitchen yesterday evening, making TikTok videos. The kitchen is down at the back of the house, and has a door with a window, which leads to the utility room. At night, the back room obviously gets dark, and the only light would have been from the kitchen. She said that she was twirling around when she saw a hand on the utility room side of the window, looking as if it were about to knock on the glass. This clearly scared her enough to ask Mom to investigate, but she found nothing that would have caused my sister to see what she had. Everyone else had been in the front end of the house watching TV, so we knew that it wasn't a family member playing a joke on her. It had happened to me years before, except it was a full person who had stood behind the door, and it happened in daylight. One final event to add more interest to the story. Her school bag was on the kitchen counter last night when everyone went to sleep. This morning, we found it in the middle of the floor with all of her books stacked neatly right beside it. This is one of the unexplained series of events and the existence of the unknown in my very intimate environment. Location. My grandma's apartment is in one of the populous areas of Yangon's downtown, which is a 30-year-old apartment that has no record of criminal activity or any violent events whatsoever. The place? There's a room in this apartment that is always gloomy and subsequently felt ominous whenever a living soul would pass around it or in it. It's a typical, normal bedroom. Queen-sized bed, modern furniture, and a picture of Jesus Christ in it. Even though there's nothing abnormal about the room itself, the aura that it gave out is evil. It used to be my late grandpa's room, in which he was suffering from hepatitis C. The problem. The room itself is locked now and no one lives in it, since it used to cause the house members and guests chills whenever a person or just someone would pass around the room unexpectedly. Whenever you look inside it, there's no one. Sometimes a 3-second-long snickering laugh in a low tone can be heard. This can happen at any time of the day. Sometimes there's nothing at all. But whenever a person tries to lay on the bed of that room, everyone who's done it has said that they felt someone is watching them with an evil smile. But it's just their feeling, including mine. Another common denominator is that we cannot identify how that evil looks or where it came from. We all know that something is just there. What all of the house members and guests agree on is that something is watching the bed, as previously stated, with an evil smile. The aftermath. Even though no one goes near there and the room is locked since my grandpa's death, we are all worried due to the frequent sounds and laughter that we can hear at any random time. My aunt, who lives with my grandma at the same apartment, said that clapping can also be heard at a certain time of night, but not regularly. But it can't be anything from upstairs coming down, because upstairs is an empty hall that's been cleaned and locked by the previous owners until they find another renter. These events are strange since they didn't happen right away after my grandparents moved in. It started happening like a decade after they've been living there. The rest is history. I hope you all can tell me what it is. All the family members are questioning to this day. I used to go to this one church that wasn't too far away from my house. I had gone there for years before noticing anything. One day I was at the church with a friend. It was just her husband, and I. There was no one else in the entire building. We were in the gym, and I heard what sounded like a cabinet door slam in another room. I got up to check and see if anyone else had come in without us noticing, but everything was quiet and empty. I was confused and tried convincing myself that maybe the pastor was playing a joke on us or something like that, though I had no idea why he wouldn't reveal himself if it was him. I walked all the way through the church, never running into anyone else. The next week it was the same scenario. Just the three of us, alone in the church yet again. I was up in the sanctuary, not doing anything important, but just playing around on my phone. I looked over toward the front where the podium was and noticed what looked like a shadow walking across the room. I'm not sure if these things are easily explained away, or if these were actually paranormal experiences. What do you all think it could be? I am right now sitting on my front porch, smoking a cigarette. I cannot bring myself to go back inside my house. There is someone in there. Just over 2 months ago, I moved into a new house after losing nearly everything to COVID. I won't go into details or draw this out. Typing this out makes my eyes well, and every hair on my body stands straight up, but damn it, I saw a human-shaped shadow in my walk-in closet. Am I going crazy? Maybe, but I know that I am not at the same time. This is what happened. I was laying on my bed browsing Reddit, and from the corner of my eye, I caught movement coming from my closet. Within literal milliseconds, I turn and see someone standing inside of it, looking right at me. I flipped out, sprung up, ran out of my room, slammed the door, and grabbed a kitchen knife. I yelled and screamed about calling police, that I had a knife, and basically acted like a scared monkey. No response. After about a minute of yelling and screaming, and realizing that I had left my phone in my bedroom to call 911, I slowly peeked in. There was simply nothing there. Nothing. No one could have gone anywhere. I am pissed and terrified about this. I saw this person. I saw their shape, their movement, their arms. There was a humanoid figure in my closet, and that is all I know. If you live in North Carolina, then you've heard of Gravity Hill. You can look it up to get information about it. One night it was me, my boyfriend, and 3 of his cousins, and we thought it would be fun to drive out to Gravity Hill and test it for ourselves. Something did, in fact, push us up the hill. Cody's car was in neutral, but something did push us up. And as we got to the top, Cody asks us if we want to go to the house. I asked what it was, and all 4 of them said, in sync, that I had to see it for myself. We drove up there, and as we got to it, it's this very old, abandoned white house. I'd say it was probably built in the late 40s, early 50s, but no one's lived in it for years. I asked him to pull into the driveway, and he did. We sat there for a minute. I wanted to see if anything would happen because I didn't believe them. We were in the driveway for 3 minutes at most when Cody said, "I'm about ready to leave, what about y'all?" As soon as he said that, his headlights dimmed so much we thought they went out. I saw someone in the upstairs window only for a second, but someone or something was standing there watching us. It frightened me so much that it brought tears to my eyes and I was shaking. We sped off and didn't look back. I still remember the feeling of all my energy leaving my body, and I never want to experience something like that ever again. In Europe, medieval churches can have grims. Grims are the spirits of animals that were buried inside them to be their guardians forever. I'm an occultist, as in studies the secret properties of things, not will sacrifice your goat to Satan, and a paranormal investigator, and thought that it would be good to pack a grim on a trip to a local church that seems to have attracted some weird entities. So I said a prayer asking for any grims of redundant churches with nothing better to do to pop in when we got there. As my team and I walked through the field ahead of this church, I said the prayer again, and there was a gust of wind contrary to the direction that the wind had been blowing in the whole time thus far. It was also much stronger than the pre-existing breeze. It moved the tops of the nearby trees with an audible whomp sound, and tore away a few loose branches. The gust didn't come from anywhere. It just appeared suddenly where we were. I don't think it traveled far, though frankly I was more impressed with the entrance than watching it. The grim could no longer be heard after a few minutes of trampling the grass, but I assume it was a good thing. A number of years ago, my mother and I were visiting my aunt in Idaho, staying in her odd house. She had always told us it was haunted, but I never really believed her because to her, everything was haunted. Well, one night during our stay, my mom woke up hearing a baby cry. My cousin Julie, her husband Matt, 10-year-old son Joe, and her daughter Cindy, who was just a few months old, were living with her at the time. My mom assumed that it was their infant daughter and asked my cousin about the crying in the middle of the night, saying something like, "I don't assume you got much sleep." Julie responded by telling her that the noise that she had heard had not been Cindy. But I had heard it right outside my door as well. She then said it must have been her son playing some sort of prank, to which Joe quickly rebutted her by saying that it was not him. Joe also said that he wasn't going back to that part of the house at night. We believed Joe, as his mother and my cousin had experienced things back there several times. He's now an adult and married, and still maintains his innocence, as well as refusing to ever stay in that house alone. Fast forward to last summer. I took a few days vacation and flew up to join my mom and see the family. One night, my aunt, mom, myself, and Joe's wife were sitting at the bar that separates her kitchen from the living room. All of a sudden, in the back of the house, we heard the sound of a door closing. I looked up to see if anyone else had heard it. They had. We got up to investigate the sound, thinking that someone else was in the house. There was not a soul to be found. Then we began to investigate what could have caused it. It sounded like a heavy metal door. We came to the conclusion that it could have been someone hit the loose bathroom door handle. The bathroom was in my line of sight, with no one else in the house at the time. The place just feels weird. It always has. There are many more stories in that house that I've heard about, but I know that I won't do them justice. I only know this story because it was told to me by a family member. I don't have much recollection of it myself. When I was younger, my mom ran an old people's home, so we lived there and I knew a lot of the people who also lived there. When I was about 4 or 5, my family and I used to love going to visit different towns and cities, check out all the landmarks. I can't remember which town it was, but we visited the church there. We were just having a look around, as you do, when suddenly as I was looking across the pews, I saw a lady. She was just sitting there, not bothering anyone at all, but apparently I burst out crying and started begging to leave. Once we got out, I'm told I kept saying that it was one of the ladies who lived in the home that my mom ran. The issue was, she had died a few weeks prior. None of my family ever saw her. The only thing I remember properly is seeing her and just being absolutely terrified. I have no idea why, but I do remember the fear itself. It was real and very intense. I still see things on occasion. Sometimes the fear is there, sometimes it isn't. A few years ago, I was still in high school, and out of my own curiosity, I tried to lucid dream. I started recording dreams for a month as soon as I woke up. I had all of them written out on a big notepad, but I never really got it to work. Anyway, one night I had a dream where a friend came to me right before I woke up, and the only thing that happened was him telling me something bad is gonna happen soon. A few days later, I completely forgot about this, but the same friend in real life keeps acting really just down in the dumps. I ask him what's wrong, and he said it's just a bummer because his uncle had a heart attack and he's worried about him. To add to it, I get a call later that day telling me that my uncle also had a heart attack on the same day and died. At that point, I had to break this weird story to him. Premonition, or just pretty creepy coincidence? He believes the story, even though I would have been skeptical. My mom and grandma have had similar experiences with premonitions, but I am now 21 and have been having them for the first time in my own life recently. A few weeks ago, I had a very vivid dream about my childhood best friend who I haven't seen or spoken to in years, and I woke up the next day to find out that she had committed suicide. Then this past week, I told my boyfriend that I missed our old coworker, who we also haven't seen or spoken to in a few years. And come to find out, he suddenly dropped dead about 15 minutes before I had made that comment. Today I took a nap and had another very vivid dream, very lucid, about my high school boyfriend. And now I'm a little bit freaked out, and I'll definitely be watching his social media over the coming days, hoping that this has just been a weird coincidence.